Hey guys, sorry I'm about 5 minutes late, but better late than never. I've just been working on a video on Kate and Armstrong that was sort of very topical, and I just wanted to get it out ASAP, so that is why I'm a little bit late. This is the letter that Vincent van Gogh wrote on either June the 1st or the 2nd. So there's the actual letter, right? And we're going to be going through basically just the month of June to tonight or today. It's 9 o'clock at night where I am, but wherever you are today, we're going to be going in this episode. We're going to be going through um, June, and from there we're going to jump all the way from June, the summer of 1882, to the winter, December 1883, when Van Gogh goes to Nuenen, right? Jean Karras, good to see you. Jean says no notification again from YouTube. Jean, you might want to unsubscribe and then resubscribe and hit the notification. Otherwise, you should just look at Patreon. Obviously, I make announcements on Patreon. So again, I don't know if you follow me on Twitter as well. Karina, good to see you. Karina also says it's really hot in Austria. It seems to be hot all over Europe. I hope you guys are keeping cool. Amy, good to see you as well. Yvonne, good to see you as well. Welcome. So this is the letter we're dealing with. Well, it's really this whole letter. You can see it's quite a long letter. But we're going to be dealing with it on this web exhibits page. I almost said web sleuths. I'll put a link to that in the description if you guys, or in the chat if you guys want to follow along. SM Kovalinsky, good to see you there. SM Kovalinsky, thanks a lot for your, what's the word, alerts in terms of the Kate and Armstrong case, as usual. Thanks a lot. Yeah, okay, so when he refers to being in hospital with clap, that seems to be slang for, well, he's got gonorrhea, and it's actually quite serious. He's not going to, although he says to his brother, I'll be here for a fortnight, in other words, for 2 weeks, he will end up being in the hospital for most of June, most of that month. He's not in the hospital yet, so this letter he's writing here, he's not in hospital yet. We're about to get to that. Karina says, wow, it's 32 degrees Celsius at 9 p.m. That is really hot. I hope you've got an air conditioner. Thanks a lot, SM Kovalinsky. Okay. Are you guys ready to get started? I must warn you guys before I get started that the power is scheduled to go out in 50 minutes. It's actually 52 minutes. But I've done 2 lives where the power didn't go off. So this time I'm going to take my chance. And if the power stays on, then luck is on our side. But the one live I did with Kathleen Hale, the power was supposed to go off and it didn't. The other one was a Van Gogh and it also didn't go off. So let's see what happens. Ventilator only. Okay, so we need to get going while the power is on, and let's see how things do go. So let's just bring this up. Okay, so this is written first or the 2nd of June, perhaps both days, from The Hague. And he writes the following: Dear Theo, your letter and its enclosure came and I paid the landlord straight away. Now, I don't know if you guys remember, he was essentially begging his brother to pay him. That was in the previous letter. Well, it's actually previous even to that one. He sent that postcard, I don't know if you remember, and he was basically saying, I've got to pay the landlord, I've got nothing to pay him, and he's not going to give me any delay. Remember that postcard, right? We dealt with that in the previous live, right? And so now he, just in time, he gets obviously a letter from Theo with the money, and here he says, I got your letter and I paid the landlord straight away. He says, since there's a mortgage on the house, the rent is collected by someone else who turned the people downstairs out last month and gave them short shrift. What you say about dividing the month into 3 so that I would get the money on the 1st, 10th, and 20th is extremely welcome news. That will make things much easier for me. So Theo sort of come up with a system saying, let's divide the month into 3 parts, and then I'll send you money kind of in 3 separate, 3 times a month, basically. And Vincent says, that certainty will really make things a lot easier. Thanks very much. I must say that clinking of the bell of the cat in the background starting to irritate me. I might get up just now and take the thing off. Anyway, he says, I need not tell you what a relief your letter was. He says, did you receive the drawing, the fish drying barn? That's this one. It's quite a nice drawing. To me, the setting is what makes it quite interesting. The drawing itself is a bit fuzzy. You notice how he signs his name there. It does seem to be signed Vincent van Gogh, not just Vincent. Okay, so he goes on to say, I'm busy doing a few more of them so that you will have 2 or 3 done in the same way. CM has also got some done like this, but I haven't heard from him yet. I want to tell you something about what you seem to be afraid of, namely the possibility that the family may want to take steps to place me under legal guardianship. So this has obviously come up, that although Theo is helping him, Theo has sort of communicated to his brother that, dude, you might be in trouble. You might be, you might be, you might be put under legal guardianship, kind of thing. In other words, you might be committed. You might be accused of being kind of crazy, and so you might go to an asylum even because of the way that you're behaving. And so he says, if you really think a few witnesses, and even then false ones, are all that would be needed to testify that you cannot manage your financial affairs, and that would be enough to entitle father to deprive you of your civil rights and place you under guardianship. It's quite interesting how this is almost a civil case that's coming up, right? In other words, he's arguing that he is of sane mind and that he has the right as an adult to take care of his affairs the way he sees fit, right? And then he says, if you really think that this sort of thing is so easy to do these days, then I take the liberty of questioning it. The legal procedure of guardianship. Now, who says that the Van Gogh story doesn't have some true crime elements to it? Well, Yeri is spelling it out himself. Susan, good to see you here. He says, the legal procedure of guardianship, which has been disgracefully abused so often in order to get rid of individuals considered troublesome or unpleasant. Then he uses a French word, mauvais coucher, which means awkward customer, can no longer be applied quite so easily these days. Now, do you guys remember, some of you guys will be aware that I've spoken about witch trials, right? In a weird way, Van Gogh is actually referring to that sort of thing, where if someone doesn't like you, if your behavior isn't socially acceptable, you can kind of control someone through some kind of mechanism. This is a little bit like that, right? And he's kind of saying, it's not actually so easy to do that. It's not going to be so easy to take control of me, kind of thing. So good point. Yvonne says, here is Vincent bucking the system again, right? So he says, the law gives the accused the right to appeal and many another remedy, right? And bear in mind, Van Gogh knows the law to some extent through his studies of theology. Studying theology would have given him some knowledge of the law, I would assume anyway. So anyway, he goes on to say, but you might say a clever lawyer can twist the law, etc., etc. Again, it's quite interesting to see this is a true crime channel. It's quite interesting to see these legal arguments where Van Gogh is making the case that you're not going to be able to legally have me committed. You're not going to be able to legally prove that I am mad, right? That's kind of what is on the cards, right? So he goes on to say, I tell you that it isn't quite so quick and easy to place somebody under guardianship nowadays. I know of a case in which even the Jesuits failed to have a guardianship order placed on someone they wanted out of the way, for the simple reason that the man said, I am positively the last person for whom a guardianship order is even slightly appropriate, and refused to give in. Again, there was the case of someone who placed under supervision somewhere against his will so that he couldn't go where he chose, warned the person under whose supervision he had been placed that he had no right to deprive him of his liberty and that he would have to let him go. Warned him a few times coolly and quite calmly, but he was rebuffed. Then bashed his guardian's brains in with a poker and stood there quite calmly and gave himself up. The case was investigated and the result was a complete acquittal, since in certain extreme cases there exists a right of self-defense. When the murder question came up, the original case was re-examined, and it turned out that the accused was not someone who merited guardianship. So again, quite ironic that you've got Van Gogh going the whole true crime route. And you may or may not know this, when Van Gogh lived in Arles, that was 1888, the Jack the Ripper story was sort of coming into its time in real time, and he was actually reading up about that. So it's quite interesting how true crime in the whole Van Gogh mythos is more relevant than you might think. Okay, so he goes on to say, in short, so he's repeating himself, just saying again, it is far from easy nowadays to place under guardianship someone who protests in a calm, manly, and open manner. I really do not believe that the family would do anything like that, but you may say they already tried to do it on the Giel occasion. Alas, yes, father is capable of doing it, but I must tell you that if he dares to try anything of the sort again, I shall resist him for all I'm worth. He had best think twice before he starts attacking me, but once again, I doubt they would dare do such a thing. If they do have the will and the temerity, I'm not going to say, oh, please don't do that. But on the contrary, we'll have no hesitation in letting them get on with it, so that they incur public disgrace and are saddled with the costs of the case. Now, I think what he's talking about here, I can think of a scenario that you could potentially have today, where let's say a friend or a family member is, let's say, a drug addict or on drugs, and they're acting in a way that is unacceptable or dangerous or whatever, and you then want that person to be committed, and then they say, well, I don't want to be committed. What do you think the legal situation is there? It's certainly problematic, isn't it? Yvonne Phillips says, poor Vincent, there's no worse battle than a family battle. Yeah. So bear in mind where we are right now, this summer of 1882, you've got this question of, are his family going to shut him down in terms of what he's trying to do, marrying this prostitute, living with her, while his brother is actually paying for it all? Are they going to try and shut him down, or what is going to happen? Well, the end result is by the winter of 1883, Van Gogh is going to be literally living with his parents again. So what seems to be a lot of confidence, a lot of bluster, a lot of Vincent being very adult and standing up for himself, well, 18 months later, he's going to be going back home with his tail between the legs and no girlfriend. He's going to be back to square one. Despite all the sound and fury, it's not really going to signify much. Does that make sense? So now he gives another example. He says, let me tell you, I know of a case where a noble and very rich family tried to place somebody under guardianship and enlisted the service of lawyers and Jesuits, and yet failed with the person in question. Although there were two complaints raised against him, in the first place, his incompetence in financial affairs. Does that ring a bell? And in the second place, he's being of unsound mind. He protested, and the judge let the family know unofficially that they would do well to drop the case. The family had to give up even before the legal proceedings actually started. Now, I would just like to add this. Since you're aware that I would always protest against anything of the kind, if at some time or other they should try to take advantage of my being ill or indisposed, by, for instance, taking action against me, you will know that it is without my consent. In the event of my being ill, I hope you would object if anyone tried to profit from my helplessness. When my health is good, I can take care of myself, and I'm afraid of nothing of that sort. And I simply cannot imagine anyone really taking such a step. But should you ever hear that such moves are afoot, please let me know. I don't mean if they are talking about it or saying something about it, of course. I take no notice of tittle tattle, but I do take notice when it is translated into action. If they should do something, then I believe you will warn me. I know the law and guardianship, and I do not believe they can do anything to me. Once before in my life, though many years ago, I received a letter written in the same vein as your last one, and that was from Tierstig, who that's his former boss, right? And he said, I consulted him about something, and I've regretted ever since that I broached the matter with him. I well remember that I was seized by a kind of panic at the time and that I was frightened of my family. Now, some 10 or 12 years later, so he was obviously about 20 years old at the time, maybe even younger, he said, I've learned to think differently of my obligations towards and relations with my family. Father keeps going on about the respect and obedience I'm supposed to owe him. I shall not claim that a child does not owe his parents respect and obedience. You know, in the Bible it says, love thy father and mother, and your days will be longer. You can imagine that a pastor would certainly repeat those words to a wayward son. And so he says, I shall not claim that a child does not owe his parents respect and obedience. All I want is to point out that father has taken undue advantage of it more than once. For instance, by immediately labeling as disrespectful any difference of opinion one may have with him. It would be a pretty kettle of fish if I ordered my life the way father would like me to. Now, if you think about it, there was a time where it looked like Vincent van Gogh was going to order his life the way his father had. He was sort of following his father's footsteps. He was also going to be preaching, right? So he goes on to say, my drawing would most certainly come to an end, for I should be unable to do any more. I might be able to come to terms with fathers who have thinking and talk things over with them if he acquired some understanding of art, but that will never happen. Clergymen often introduce things of beauty into a sermon, but it's dismal stuff and dreadfully stodgy. Now I'm glad that you have given me your frank opinion of Sien. So Sien is his girlfriend. And he says, namely, that she tricked me, so that this is his frank opinion. This is Theo's opinion communicated to Vincent of Sien, right? And he's saying, Sien tricked you and allowed you to be taken in. And I can understand why you should think that, because such things do happen, right? He goes on to say, however, I remember once when a girl did try something like that, I shut the door in her face so hard that I rather doubt I'm likely to be taken in by such sharp practices. The fact is, Vincent is quite a naive guy, certainly in the matters of the heart. Anyway, he goes on to say, the way matters stand with Sien is that I'm genuinely attached to her. Now, bear in mind, she's a prostitute. She's pregnant with another man's child. She already has a child with another man, but he's attached to her, right? And he says, she to me, she's my loyal helpmate who goes everywhere with me and who's becoming more indispensable to me by the day. I feel less passion for her than I did for Kivos last year. Well, that is a bit of a concession. He's saying, I don't love her as much as I loved Kivos. Wanzi, good to see you here as well. He says, but the kind of love I have for Sien is the only one I am still capable of after the disappointment of that first passion. So you almost get the sense that he's emotionally hobbled and he's almost like an emotional cripple who is sort of, what's the word, limping along, and he's somehow able to have this relationship it's inappropriate, but it's nevertheless working for him in some way. Then he says, but the kind of love, okay, then he says, she and I are two unhappy people who keep each other company and share burden. It's quite a statement to make as well. So it's almost like, what's that saying about misery loves company? So it's almost like because they're both needy and desperate, they end up unhappily together, but there's something that works in that arrangement. And then he says, that is precisely why unhappiness is making way for happiness and the unbearable is becoming bearable. So you kind of get this sense that it's almost like he's on the rebound and she's on some kind of rebound as well. Then he says, her mother is a little old woman, just like the ones Freire paints. Now you will understand that given that I remain faithful to her, I should set little store by the formality of marriage, were it not that the family does. Father, for one, and I know this for certain, attaches great importance to it. And although he won't approve of my marrying her, he would consider it even worse if I lived with her without being married. His advice would be to leave her, and he would give that advice in this form: wait, which is cold comfort and quite inappropriate. That is typical of father. He puts things off that are urgent and pressing, and this can be absolutely infuriating. So father had best keep his waiting to himself, for if he came out with it, I should not be able to contain myself. I'm a man of 30, with wrinkles on my forehead and lines on my face that make me look 40, and my hands are full of furrows. That's quite a statement he makes there as well. Yet when father looks at me through his spectacles, he sees a little boy. 1.5 years ago, father wrote to me, you are in your first youth. And that is said with a tuppence worth of profundity I have heard so often before. Do you know what I think father and Uncle Stricker are like? Like Les Deux Oreilles by Jerome, but I am a mauvais coucher. I'm not quite sure. I think he referred to that up here. Mischievous, what was it? Awkward customer. Van Gogh definitely is an awkward customer in a way. Do you agree with that? He's someone who doesn't easily fit into a stereotype. Then he says, now you will say, Vincent, you had far better lose yourself in perspective in the fish drying sheds. Then I shall say, you are quite right, brother. That is why I'm getting down to work on the 2 drawings that go with that first one, and which you will soon be receiving as proof that I like nothing better than losing myself in nature and drawing, and not losing myself in such things as being placed under guardianship, which seemed to me utterly ridiculous. And I mean, that is his fate. He will end up being under a kind of guardianship where he will actually volunteer. He will on his own, what's the word? At his own, sort of on his own recognizance, he will allow himself to be signed up to the asylum of Saint-Remy, right? That's waiting for him like within, what is it, 7 years, right? And then he goes on to say, regards with my heartfelt thanks for your loyal help, ever yours, Vincent. And then there's quite a long, really long postscript here. He says, I kept this letter back because I wanted to send you the small drawings at the same time, but they still need more work. One is finished though, namely another fish drying shed. Sien and I have been camping in the dunes from morning till night for days on end, like real bohemians. I wonder what Sien thinks of that. We took bread along and a small bag of coffee and fetched hot water from a hot water and coals woman in Scheveningen. That hot water and coals woman and her surroundings are marvelous, charming beyond words. I've called at her little shop as early as 5 o'clock in the morning, when the street sweepers go there for their coffee. My dear fellow, that would really be something to draw. Just getting the people I want to pose would cost a pretty penny, but I've a good mind to do it. Write to me when you get a chance, particularly what you think of these last 3 drawings, and also if it is really your view that I ought to be more afraid than I am of being placed under guardianship, to my mind, an impossible eventuality. So in a way, he's kind of just saying, I'm not intimidated, I'm not scared, I'm not, what's the word? I'm not going to be bullied by that threat, kind of thing. So it just shows you how he's actually got quite a strong sense of self. He's not a pushover, he's not this emotionally vulnerable, nervous wreck kind of thing. He's not being undone by a little bit of anxiety, right? Then he says, I should not remain indifferent if steps were actually taken. Now, I just want to kind of repeat what I've said before, where a lot of people will say Van Gogh was mad. My brother actually said today, I saw him today, and he said he suffered from schizophrenia, right? That he had paranoid delusions. And I said, when was that kind of thing? When exactly did he imagine things, right? But what I'm trying to get at is, if Van Gogh was alive today, I don't know if he would agree with what the mainstream think about him, that he was mad, that he was this or that label. And here you have him actually defending himself against his sanity, against his own family accusing him of not being rational, right? He's quite vehement in his ability to think for himself. And you can tell from his letters that although his behavior is not necessarily completely intelligent, I'm talking about his behavior. His behavior is not necessarily intelligent, but his letters are. His letters are lucid and rational and logical. Does that make sense? His behavior is not necessarily that sensible, but his letters are full of sensibility. Karina says his resilience is admirable always. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Here he is defending his own sensibility in no, what's the word? In no, there's sort of no two ways about it. He's being absolutely explicit. You're not going to legally be able to declare me incompetent. I know exactly what I'm doing, right? He doesn't do it in a way that is emotional. He doesn't do it in a way that is spiteful. He's quite reasonable and smart in the way that he does it. Does that make sense? I mean, how would you feel if your family said, we're going to have you committed? Would you be able to respond with such equanimity, right? So anyway, he goes on to say, I should not remain indifferent if steps were actually being taken. That goes without saying. Having to go to Eton would be most inconvenient for me right now. He's talking about having to go home. He said he wouldn't really like that. And of course, 18 months from now, that's exactly where he's going to be. Home, although his new home will be in Nuenen. Then he says, I'm so busy and firstly, it'll be inconvenient because I'm busy, and secondly, because the trip would cost me more than I can afford, and I would sooner spend it on Sien. Remember, Sien is her name, but he also refers to her as Christine, and sometimes with an X and teen, right? Then he says, I think it is a delightful prospect that you are coming. I'm longing to know what impression Sien will make on you. Well, I'm not so sure Theo is going to be so impressed with Sien as Vincent is. Then he goes on to say, there's nothing special about her. She's just an ordinary woman of the people who has something of the sublime for me. Whoever loves a plain, ordinary person has endeared himself to her is happy, despite the dark side of life. Had she not endeared help last winter, then the bond between her and me would not have been forged in the circumstances. That is, after my disappointment and spurned love. So that is a real present background to him falling for Sien. If he wasn't so disappointed and hurt and damaged and disappointed by things that happened with Kivas, he probably wouldn't have been in the situation. What do you think he's talking about when he talks about what is sublime for him in his relationship with Sien. What do you think that's about? I think that's quite an important part in terms of his priorities at this point in his life. Anyway, he goes on to say, as it was, however, it was precisely the feeling of being able to do something useful after all, despite the disappointment, that brought me to myself again and revived me. Not that I went out looking for it, but I found it, and now there is a warm affection between her and me, and it would be quite wrong to give that up. I might easily have grown disenchanted and skeptical if I'd not met Sien. I think that's almost another way of saying depressed. You know, he didn't want to sort of be broken up with or sort of left out, and even what's the word, is rejected by his family. I think he felt like he'd been rejected by everybody, and then he didn't want to just feel lonely and dejected, and then Sien helped him not feel that way, I guess. So he says, she and my work now keep me going. And I should like to add this: because Sien is taken to all the toil and moil of a painter's life. I quite like that. I quite like the way that that is stated. My brother said to me today, I can't quite remember, I think it was another artist said to him, it may have been, was it Monet or Pissarro? I don't know, but another artist apparently said to Van Gogh, this is when he was in Paris, you paint like a madman, you know, like, because he paints really, really quickly. He also mentioned how, although Tierstik said to him, of one thing I'm absolutely sure, you cannot paint. Van Gogh, I won't say replied in this way, but he ultimately replied, if somebody says to you, you can't paint, then by all means paint. I also thought that is quite a nice way of thinking about it. Yvonne says, his letters are always so humane and honest, even when he shocks me. Roses are red, P54. Good to see you here. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so he goes on to say, I think I shall become a better artist with her than if I had ended up with Key Boss. That's quite a big statement to say as well. For though Sien is not as graceful and her manners are perhaps, or rather certainly quite different, she is so full of goodwill and devotion that I am moved by it. Well, Vincent, not for long. Sien is going to dump you. So just, yeah. Anyway, it says, Heyerdahl has seen sorrow now, and I should be glad if a draftsman, for instance, Henry Peel, could have a look at the last three drawings. I'm sure Peel no longer remembers me, though I have been in his company and know that he's someone who can behave very oddly at times. And I don't know whether he would say anything. But all I should want to know is whether the drawings make any impression on him, and if they appeal to him. I say this in case you run into Peel from time to time, for it would have to be as if by chance that you let him see them. Then his final paragraph in this pretty long letter, he says, I must also repeat that I'm getting on very well with my collection of woodcuts, which I regard as belonging to you. Okay, I'm not really going to read that any further. Now we go on to the 2nd of June, and it's another long letter. It's really taken a long time to get through a short period of the Hague period, but I think you'll agree that it's been worthwhile getting quite bogged down, because all of this is connected, and it's important to see how he works through his crises. Do you agree with that? Okay, so he says, Dear Theo, what I feel obliged to tell you once more is this. Now, bear in mind, he's writing to Theo. First, he was writing to Theo like, please don't, now that you know about Sien, please keep sending me money, right? That's the first crisis he's averted. So Theo did send him money, he was able to pay his rent. Now the next crisis is, are my parents going to have me committed, right? Now he's got to convince his brother that he's sane and sensible. So he says the following, you know very well that up to this very day, there's been nothing in my life of a criminal nature. and that I am in full possession of my civil rights as a Netherlander. Again, what he's trying to do is make the case that you can't take my rights away from me. You can't have me committed. You can't put me under guardianship. He's basically making the case that he's of sound mind, right? And that he can argue his sound-mindedness in a letter and, if needs be, in a court as well. So he goes on to say, thanks a lot, Yvonne. He goes on to say, further, that I shall take good care to avoid all things prohibited by the laws of this country, but consequently that I shall not suffer myself to be molested or to be put under guardianship or anything of the sort. I know quite well that in our family, very ugly things have been said about me repeatedly and in various ways, although I do not know the source from which they originated. But I very much doubt whether those who said them would have the courage to swear to them before a judge or something like that. So he's being pretty kind of aggressive, saying that I'd like to see my family members make certain statements about me in front of a judge. Then he says, I do not know if you have the Dutch constitution and other laws in your possession. Personally, I've consulted them repeatedly on questions in which I myself was concerned when I was in doubt whether this or that was legally justified. Not just the Dutch laws. At times I even took the trouble to compare the Dutch regulations with the French or English constitutions. It wasn't just necessary for me to look up the law. I had to in the past when I was studying some points in history. Remember, that's exactly what I said, that as part of his theology, he likely had to study the law. Robbie Robbins says, do you think we are more shocked with his choices because we have transported ourselves back in time, like when reading a historical novel, than if he had behaved like this today? Robbie, I think if he behaved like this today, I think we'd still be shocked. I think anybody behaving like this would still be shocking. I think what makes it doubly shocking anyway is he is the son of a pastor. I think that within that context, it makes it doubly shocking, right? Great point from Yvonne. Yvonne says, this is the kind of thing Vincent excels in, defending himself. Yeah. Okay, so he goes on to say, now if Vincent was a nervous wreck and a mad person and insensible, he wouldn't be this good at defending himself. If he wasn't so self-possessed, he wouldn't be able to possess himself so well. If he didn't have a strong personal sense of identity, he wouldn't be able to defend his decisions as well as he does, right? Then he goes on to say, I can tell you in all tranquility that I'm waiting for things to take their course. I only hope that nothing of the sort will happen and that, on the contrary, the family will prove disposed to arrange things reasonably and peacefully should the necessity arise. So I actually think what's going on is a game that's going both ways. I think the game is from the family side where they're saying, let's not be too shocked and let's not react. He's threatening to marry this woman. Maybe it's going to happen, but let's see whether it does happen. And he's almost seems to be calling their bluff, saying, I'm waiting for things to take their course. I only hope that nothing of the sort will happen. So in a weird way, there's kind of a mutual stalemate. And we do know that ultimately he doesn't marry Sien and ultimately does move back with the family. So it is in a way much ado about nothing, if that makes sense. Karina says today he would be torn apart by social media. I think that is very true. I think that is very true. In fact, you could make the argument that Van Gogh is actually taking advantage of Sien, right? I think you could definitely make that. If you look at the fact that he's desperate to be with a woman, and now he's got this woman that is living with him, but she's ill and she's pregnant and she's got a child and it's not his child. Well, isn't he doing things for his own benefit? He kind of spins it as he's a very moral fellow, but I think you could sort of put another spin on it as well, which is that he's taking advantage, even in a coercive way, of Sien. Bear in mind, Sien eventually dumps him. It's not like he says, sorry, Sien, it's not working out. And she's like, please don't leave me, right? Then he goes on to say, I must tell you, Theo, that sometimes I perceive that father, for instance, does not always take the trouble to look things up, or that he bases and maintains a judgment on such shaky premises and such superficial impressions, information or gossip, that it doesn't cut any ice. Just a reminder that officially the power is supposed to cut out in 15, well, now it's 14 minutes. So if I suddenly disappear, it's not something that I didn't expect, but it's also possible that it's not going to cut out. So we'll see what happens. Fingers crossed. Anyway, just to remind you that it's possibly 14 minutes from now. Anyway, it goes on to say, besides, one should not consider a clause separately without relation to other laws, but rather related to the modifications and clarifications of the pertinent clauses which appear with it. Well, now he sounds a lot like a lawyer, doesn't he? Then he says, when the law says, for instance, a child owes respect to its parents, which is an introduction to the law on paternal rights, it is not enough to fly into a rage and say, you don't show enough respect for your parents. One ought to think it over and try to find out if there really is something illegal in a child's behavior before one starts shouting about the law. Well, that is definitely a reasonable argument that is making there. You know, is what I'm doing patently illegal, yes or no? It might be inadvisable, it might be foolish, but am I actually breaking the law, right? Then he says, but this is what happens so often in our family. There is some gossip, it is inflated, it is exaggerated to the limit, and then they form an opinion or a resolution about someone, sometimes wholly without the particular person's knowledge or without having talked it over with them, only taking notice of impressions, hearsay, communications. The devil take them, particularly the last. Our venerable Uncle Sent also has a way of gathering information which I consider anything but fair. As for me, when I saw such things happen at home, I told Father often enough, you will find no blessings in it. Just think, Theo, different things might have been at home. For instance, if Father could have been less distrustful of me, a bit less suspicious. Now, I must say, do you think that Vincent deserves to be trusted? I just mean in a general sense. Like if you were living with Van Gogh, would you feel like I can trust this guy with anything? He's a really honest dude. You know, he's actually in a way been lying to his brother not once but twice. Not in a seriously dishonest way, but he hasn't been truthful to his brother about Kivos, and he hasn't been truthful to his brother about Sien. The only reason he told his brother about Sien was when Mauve found out, right? And when Mauve and him had a big disagreement. So he's not dishonest, but he's also not completely honest either. Anyway, he goes on to say, if instead of considering me a person who could only do wrong, he had shown more patience and goodwill in order to understand my real intentions, in which he has always been sorely mistaken. In the first place, he would have felt less grief on my account and would have been easy on his mind about me. And in the second place, he would have spared me much sorrow. For it is a great sorrow to think this is worse than having no home at all, no father, no mother, no relations. And I've often thought so, as I do now. But one thing is certain, it is wrong to act and leave the person concerned out of things. I do not even believe in a family council taking resolutions about a person unless the accused, or rather the person over whom the family council was gathered, is present. Now, doesn't this feel like a very legalistic letter? It's very well-reasoned, but very dry in a way. It feels like Van Gogh has put on sort of the clothing of a barrister or a lawyer. he goes on to say, in most cases, nothing more than intrigue and occasionally a vindication of family pride. And then he uses this French term, much ado about nothing. Funny enough, I've been saying the same thing, that this is all going to turn out to be much ado about nothing. But often something is decided upon which proves that the persons who were present did not take the law into account, and the resolution would not cut any ice if it were actually laid before a judge. He's right about that. He is right about that. If I really were bad or vicious or a mischief maker or a low schemer or an incompetent, I should be really afraid. So there he is. There he is kind of saying, you know, I would be anxious if I was actually mentally incompetent. In other words, he's saying, I know that I'm not mentally incompetent, right? So he goes on to say, however, being what I am, I firmly believe I not need be afraid of anything the family or some members of the family may attempt to do. It is my sincere wish that nothing will be attempted, not because I'm afraid, but because I prefer peace to bickering. I do wish you knew Sien, but you are so far away, and it is impossible for me to describe a person in such a way that you would know her well just from that description. However, I can try. So this is where he seems to be trying to humanize, provide a human portrait of Sien in a way, you know, through words, not through actually painting a portrait. And so this is how he does it. He says, do you remember our old nurse at Zundert, Lien Veerman? Let's try that again. Lien Veerman. If my memory does not deceive me, Sien is that kind of person. The type of profile resembles L'Ange de la Passion. I think that means an angel of passion or something, by Landel. You know the one I mean, a kneeling figure. The print is published by Goupil. I wonder whether I can try and find that. Let's see if I can find it somewhere. Just give me a second. See if I can bring it up. I think it's this picture. So he's comparing her to this particular portrait. All right, that is what comes to mind when he thinks of her. And you kind of get the sense of what's the word, you kind of get a sense of that someone is, there's some soothing humanity at work, right? That someone is a shoulder to lean on, a shoulder to cry on, just someone that you can share time with and moments with and emotions with and some of your history with, right? Okay, so glad I could find that. So he goes on to say, but of course she's not exactly like this. I say it only to give an idea of the lines of her face. She's slightly pockmarked, so she's no longer beautiful, but the lines of her figure are simple and not ungraceful. So it's almost like he's saying she doesn't have a beautiful face, but the lines of her, she's got a nice body, basically. Quite interesting. What I appreciate in her is that she's not coquettish with me, goes her way quietly, is thrifty, is quite willing to adapt herself to the circumstances and to learn. So what do you think he means by that word? I mean, that word is like a sex kitten. It's flirtatious, provocative, seductive. Yeah, like a sex kitten. And he's saying she's not like that. Right? And then he goes on to say, she's useful to me just because she is no longer handsome, no longer young, no longer foolish. Her health has been very bad, and last winter she was very weak. Well, guess what? Her bad health is something that is going to be Vincent's problem quite soon. He's about to go to the hospital as well. Now, by eating simple food, by walking in the open air a lot, and by taking baths, she has become much healthier and stronger. But pregnancy is a difficult time. However, her speech is ugly, and she often says things and uses expressions which, for instance, our sister Wilhelmine, who has been brought up differently, would never use. So you can imagine her using expletives and saying things with reference to perhaps the sexual act and excrement or whatever, that for a cultured fellow, that Van Gogh is certainly ugly and doesn't sit well with him, right? Anyway, it goes on to say, but this is something that I don't mind in the least. I would rather have her speak coarsely and be good than be refined in speech and heartless. But that is just it. She has a good heart, has endurance, patience, and goodwill, puts herself out to help me. She comes every week to clean the studio to save the money I should have to play a cleaning woman. Well, we shall be poor at times, but as long as she has enough to eat, she's not sickly in the sense of having some ailment. But she has suffered a great deal. For instance, she had smallpox and later throat trouble. But there is no reason why she cannot live long and get quite well again. Okay, 4 minutes to possible blackout. Let's hold thumbs. Yvonne says she's not a prude. She's definitely not a prude. Yvonne says, wow, maybe that's how you viewed her emotionally, right? He goes on to say, I must put a question to you confidentially. Do you think Father is afraid that I shall ask him for money on this occasion? He's sort of wondering, is Dad upset about this because he thinks I'm going to need money from him, right? Then he says, I certainly wouldn't. Father has often told me that my education, etc., has cost more than that of the others. Therefore, in case of my marriage, I would not ask Father for anything, not even for an old cup and saucer. Sien and I have what's strictly necessary. The only thing we cannot do without, as long as I do not sell my work, is the 150 francs from you for rent, bread, shoes, drawing materials, in short, for daily expenses. So he's kind of saying, that's all I demand. I'm not going to ask anything more from Dad. Then he says, I ask nothing, not even an old cup and saucer. I ask but one single thing, to let me love and care for my poor, weak, ill-used little wife as well as my poverty permits, without their trying to separate, worry, or hurt us. Nobody cared for her or wanted her. She was alone and forsaken, like a worthless rag. I remember somewhere in one of his letters, he describes her as a little dove. And then someone kind of quite cleverly used that metaphor and said, well, that dove is going to fly away. Anyway, I thought that was quite clever. Here he describes her as a worthless rag and then says, I've taken her up and given her all the love, all the tenderness, all the care that was in me. She has felt this and she has revived, or rather she's reviving. You know the old fable or parable? There was a poor woman in a town who had but one single little ewe lamb, which he had bought and fed. And it had been raised in his house. It ate his bread and drank from his cup and slept in his arms. And it was like a daughter to him. There's also a rich man in that town who possessed many herds of sheep and oxen. But he took that one ewe lamb from the poor man and killed it. You see, if Tearstick, for instance, could do what he liked, he would separate Sien from me, force her back into her former damned life, which she has always hated. And why? Now, if you think about that, Sien in the end chooses to go back to this life that she hated, because life with Van Gogh, this strange artist, is actually ultimately even more intolerable, right? He goes on to say, know it well, the life of the woman, of the children, of me, depends on that little thread of 150 francs a month until my work begins to sell. If that little thread breaks before that time, then morturi ter solutant, not sure what that means. I don't know, that'll be the end, I guess. Okay, 1 minute, the power could go out, we'll see. It is the least we can manage on, and only with the greatest economy at that. But we are happy this way because love binds us so closely. Whether father and mother take it quietly or not will 3/4 depend on what you tell them. If you oppose me, then the trouble starts. That's what he's really afraid of. He says, if you oppose me, my brother, if you oppose me, that's when it's going to get difficult. If you say something like, keep calm, don't meddle, or if you try to reassure them in some way, they will keep quiet. You need not compromise yourself, however, or take any responsibility. In no way for that responsibility rests with me. Again, a very well-reasoned letter, isn't it? There's no emotion, there's no wagging his finger, right? I challenge you to be this cordial and sensible under some of the circumstances. Of course, you probably wouldn't be in the situation, but still. Yvonne says, yes, he revived her well enough for her to fly away. Good point. Then he goes on to say, you can reassure them in two ways as to the financial side, meaning our parents. First, that I have your monthly allowance for the necessary expenses. I have yours, Theo's. Secondly, I shall not ask anything from them, not a penny, not even an old cup and saucer. Finally, that I already have what's strictly necessary, furniture, bedding, child's clothes, cradle, etc. Well, brother, I hope all dramatic scenes will be avoided, that we may all keep calm. That is what I hope and strive for. Now, bear in mind, within a short time, I think within about 5 days from this, Van Gogh will be sick in hospital. So obviously this is stressing him out, as even though his letters are as well reasoned as they are. So at the moment, it's 1 minute past 10. Touch wood, the lights are going to stay on. So far, so good. So the very next day, 3rd of June, he writes this letter. Now, have a look at this image. Do you think this is a good image? What do you think of that as a portrait? Do you think that's quite a good portrait? Now, when I saw that portrait, I thought, that's excellent. Well, guess what? It's not by Van Gogh. It's by this guy, Herkomer. And that happens a lot. I see images between Van Goghs, and I think, jeepers, that's really, really good, except it's not by him. Here's another one. I think we've seen it before. The homeless and the hungry. So when you look at that portrait or that picture, you think, that's great, that's excellent. And then it turns out Van Gogh didn't do it, right? Which I think puts into a little bit of perspective Van Gogh as an artist. He's not necessarily such a great artist. Certainly at this point, he's not very good at all. And it's going to take him another year and a half to paint that portrait that made world news, Head of a Peasant Woman, which is so-so. You know, it's going to take him another year and a half just to get to that point, right? So anyway, these are some of the portraits that come up here. I think this is a relatively short letter. I'm definitely not going to go through all of these wood engravings names, so that'll shorten it a little bit. Anyway, so he says, Dear Theo, today, Saturday, I'm sending you those two drawings, fish drying barns in the dunes at Scheveningen and carpenter's workshop and a laundry. That's these two. I've been thinking of you very often lately, and also that time long ago when, as you remember, you visited me once at The Hague, and we walked together along the Rijswijk Road and drank milk at that mill. It may be that this has influenced me somehow when doing these drawings. I've tried to draw the things as naively as possible, exactly as I saw them before me. Looking back on those days of the mill, how sympathetic that time always seems to me. However, it would have been impossible for me to put what I saw and felt on paper. So I say that the changes time brings do not alter my basic feelings. I think they are just developed in another form. My life, and perhaps after all yours too, is not as sunny now as it was then. Just kind of talking about the drudgery of being a grown-up, that their youth is past and that real life is kind of a bummer, right? And then he says, But I would not go back, because through that very trouble and adversity, I've seen some good arise, namely the ability to express that feeling. So with life experience, he's developed some perspective and the ability to be quite eloquent about life, reality, and his circumstances. In other words, he's not lost in the maelstrom of emotion anymore. He's starting to um, find his place in the world. I'm not necessarily saying he's doing that well, but he's doing that in some way. He's certainly not as lost in a theoretical world as he was. He goes on to say, Rappard was greatly pleased with a drawing similar to one which Mauve has, and also with all the others I drew for Mauve, especially the large one of the little yard. And he is a man who understands my intentions and who appreciates all the difficulties. I think you would find Rappard greatly changed since his first visit to Paris when you knew him. In front of me is a book, an illustrated household edition of Dickens. I've often sort of reiterated that Van Gogh is attracted to the Dickensian approach, the sort of humble peasant approach. Can you guys remember that other word that we mentioned? It begins either with a P or an E or something. The word of someone who goes on a long journey. That was a word that really meant a lot to him. Can you guys remember that word? I was trying to remember it the other day and I just couldn't remember it. It's something like a peasant. Oh, it's a pilgrim. That's the word. I think the classic Dickensian story is the story of a pilgrim, and that's the kind of the story that he is romantic. He has romanticized himself. Van Gogh wants to go on his own kind of pilgrimage, and in a sense, you get a sense that through these adventures that he goes on, this is one of them with Sien, or call them misadventures. He's on some kind of pilgrimage towards poverty, towards suffering. In some ways, he sees being destitute as a raw romantic experience of life, in a way. I think part of that is also out of necessity that well, it's already 7 minutes past 10. So far, so good. That he takes his circumstances and tries to um, be optimistic about them, almost tries to see them as meaningful in his own way. Anyway, he goes on to say, there are some parts of old London in which, on account of the peculiar wood engravings, have quite a different aspect from, for instance, the carpenter's shop. But I believe that the way to acquire that strength and power is quietly to continue observing faithfully. I'm just going to jump to the next paragraph. He says, I've had news from Mauve in the form of a postal order for 20 guilders, but without one written word. So there's still enmity between Van Gogh and Mauve. Mauve is his cousin, and Mauve is sort of not actually sure if Mauve is his uncle or his cousin, but anyway, Mauve is an accomplished artist and has been until recently. So he's a family member, but he's also an accomplished artist in the family who Van Gogh has fallen out of favor with, and because of what he's been doing lately, and now he gets this communication, just a postal order for 20 guilders, nothing else. Then he says, I do not know as yet whether he will give me a new order or whether the drawings are to his liking. So he doesn't get any feedback from Mauve. Mauve has, I think, asked him for drawings, and he doesn't get any feedback except that some money is being sent to him. Now, funny enough, today, when I was driving with my brother and sister, I think my sister said something like, did Vincent ever sell his art? And my brother said he only ever sold one painting, The Red Vineyard. Strictly speaking, that's true, but technically he did manage to sell some drawings, but to family members like Mauve and Uncle Cor, and I suppose you could say those are sympathy sales, but nevertheless, technically, he did get a little bit of money from one or other family member for some drawings he did, right? So again, the myth that he never sold an artwork in his life, actually sold a couple to some family members, also um, to the Red Vineyard. And then there was a certain amount of trading that took place where he would give paintings in exchange for other things. I can't remember exactly what it is, but I think in some cases it was for accommodation, it could have been. And I think there were a couple of cases where he gave paintings in exchange for something. In other words, he traded it. Technically not a sale, but nevertheless a kind of transaction. He goes on to say, in comparison with the price paid for the first one, 30 guilders, and taking into consideration that this last parcel, the first contained 12 little ones, this one contained one small one, and was more important than the first, it seems to me that Mauve was not in a good mood when he received them. So Vincent's impression is that Mauve, his esteem in Mauve's mind has gone down. Does that make sense? That Mauve is giving him less money for his art. And he says, for some reason or other, my drawings didn't please him, right? Then he says, I will readily admit that to an eye that is accustomed to watercolors, there might be something crude in drawings in which one has scratched with a pen and lights have been rubbed out or put in again with body color. So here Van Gogh is admitting that he's not really such a good artist and that his art may be a bit disappointing. Now, I've told you myself that I find his art not terribly good, right? And in this case here, you look at this and you think, wow, that is a really good drawing. I need to find out that Van Gogh didn't do it. You look at this and you say, wow, that is really well done. I need to find out Van Gogh didn't do that. And then when you look at what he did do, you think that's so. I must say that to me is not bad. It's not excellent, but it's not bad. If you look at this, it's so. It's also kind of so what. Anyway, so Mauve isn't terribly impressed. He says there are people who are not afraid of that crudeness, just as there are people who think it's sometimes pleasant and invigorating for a healthy man to take a walk during a storm. Weissenbruch, for instance, would not think these drawings unpleasant or uninteresting. So here he is defending his not so great art, right? Karina says, a wee reward for the South African power grid keepers. I wish I could add some zeros to it. Thank you, Nick, with all my heart. Thanks a lot. Timmy, I think you need to... His paw is caught under the armrest. Timmy, you need to... you need to say thank you. I think you must maybe go and lie so well. Timmy says thanks. Thank you. Okay. Okay, thanks for that, Karina. Kathy says, for me, I like the detail. Anyway, the point is, Mauve didn't really like it, and also no one really liked his art for the next 6 years, 6 years. So he goes on to say, as things are, I should like to know whether Mauve would care to order new ones. Of course, I will not or cannot force them on him, but I hope that when you come here, you will find out how things stand. So it's kind of quite pushy. He's saying, I've got this order from Mauve, am I going to get another one? You can see Vincent's definitely quite pushy and confident, but ultimately he's going to be back to square one kind of thing, you know, when he goes back to his parents. Then he says, of course, I'm content with 20 guilders. Now, bear in mind, rent was like 12 guilders 50. So that's almost 2 months' rent that he's gotten for these sketches. Then he says, particularly because I left it to him to fix the price, but I thought that he would not give me 10 guilders less for these than for the previous lot. So he's also quite disappointed. If he approves of my beginning another 6 or 12 drawings for him, I shall certainly do so, because I shall not let any opportunity to sell something pass. Now, what do you guys think? Do you think that he's going to get another order from Mauve? If Mauve has said, do some more sketches for me and I'll give you 30 guilders, instead Mauve sends him 20 guilders with no note, nothing. Do you think he's going to get another order from Mauve? What do you guys think? Yvonne says, didn't Mauve want Vincent to use watercolors more, but Vincent really didn't always want to be instructed on how to paint. You could be right. The fact is he brings it up. He says, what does he say here? He just says that Mauve's eye is accustomed to watercolors exclusively, and so it may have come as a bit of a shock to get these sort of dull gray and black and white, drawings kind of thing. Anyway, he goes on to say, I shall try my best to please him, for if it only pays my rent and makes things somewhat easier for me, it is worthwhile. But he himself had spoken of paying more rather than less for more elaborate drawings. And if I mention it, it is after all because I want to know what to do in case of a possible new order or no order at all. It may also be that he will write about it himself later on. One of these days when I have time, I shall send you a little list of my collection of wood engravings. I'm sure you will like them. Well, he actually ends up doing it in this letter. He says, if it is true that last winter I've spent less for paint than other artists, I've spent more on making an instrument for studying proportion and perspective. Mauve wants watercolors. Okay. The description of which can be found in a book by Albrecht Dürer, which the old Dutch masters also used. It makes it possible to compare the proportion of objects nearby with those on a more distant plane in cases where construction according to the rules of perspective is not possible. And when one tries to do it with the eye alone, unless one is an expert and very far advanced, it is always hopelessly wrong. I'm just going to skip that paragraph. Then he says, I should be very pleased if you perhaps had in your wardrobe a discarded coat and pair of trousers fit for me. For when I buy something, I do my best to get things which are as practical as possible for working in the dunes or at home, but my street clothes are getting very shabby. And though I'm not ashamed to wear common clothes when I go out to work, I am ashamed indeed of gentlemen's clothes that have a shabby, genteel air. But my work clothes are not untidy at all, just because I have seen to take care of them and make the necessary small repairs. This is quite a contrast to when Vincent was in the Borinage and he didn't care at all about his clothing. Now he sort of does. And you've got to think that he's aware of clothing because he's with a woman and because of what the people around them think and say. Paddy, good to see you here. You're lucky to actually find us here with the lights on. Anyway, it goes on to say, I close this letter by repeating that I hope so much the family will not regard my relation with Sien as an intrigue, which it isn't at all. This would disgust me beyond words and raise the barrier between us still higher. What I hope is that people with a certain untimely wisdom will not meddle in order to prevent my living with her. Quite interesting here. He says, you speculated about an inheritance, but that is quite out of the question. There's nothing for me to inherit that I know of. So you kind of get the sense that the family are trying to use levers, right? You kind of get the sense that they are trying to manipulate Van Gogh in certain ways. And one of the ways they're trying to manipulate him is through the notion, the promise, the prospect of a potential inheritance. That don't do this, it might actually cost you in inheritance, or is it worth it? again, his defense is to say, you know what, there's no inheritance on the cards for me, so it's fine, right? In other words, I'm not going to be manipulated. I'm not going to be incentivized. I'm not going to be. It's not going to be a carrot that is going to be useful, right? So again, quite a. You see once again just how Vincent can stick to his guns when he wants to, right? Okay, so let's bring that up again. So he says, that's quite out of the question. There's nothing for me to inherit that I know of. There cannot be anything, I think, for there is nothing, in my opinion. They have literally no money at home. The only person from whom I might have inherited in quite different circumstances, because I am named after him, Uncle Vincent, is someone whom I've been on decidedly bad terms with for years. So money is something that he can't be tempted with, right? And then he talks about, I hope that if we meet by chance, like we did last year, we shall not have a public quarrel. And now with a handshake, yours sincerely, Vincent. And then he goes through all of these engravings, which I'm not going to go through. Okay, now on to the next letter. When are we going to get to Vincent in hospital? So this is to Anton van Rappard, I think quite a short letter. Now we're getting very close to the hospital period where he's actually ill. He says, I'm returning the 250 guilders you were so kind as to lend me. I got a letter about my drawings, but received even less than I expected, although I did not expect more than 30 guilders for the 7 sheets. Yeah, you kind of get a sense that Van Gogh is trying to stir. He's trying to communicate indirectly with Mauve through Rappard, right? And he doesn't really have to communicate with Rappard, but he finds a way to do that, hoping that Rappard's going to communicate with Mauve, and Mauve's going to feel perhaps humiliated or uncomfortable. Do you agree with that? That's his agenda. Because he communicates this in his very first paragraph. He says, I received even less than I expected. I received 20 guilders with a scolding in the bargain, right? Did I happen to think that such drawings had the slightest commercial value? I think you will admit that times are not easy and such experiences, and there are so many worse things compared with other kinds of treatment. This may be called generous, and such experiences, I say, are not exactly very encouraging. Art is jealous and demands our whole strength, and then when one devotes all one's powers to it, to be looked upon as a kind of unpractical fellow and all other kinds of other things, yes, that leaves a bitter taste in one's mouth. So this is an early, what's the word? This is an early moment where Van Gogh doesn't get the kind of support, interest, encouragement that he wants and expects, right? And that's going to be, and this is how he responds to it. He's a little bit resentful, he's a little bit bitter, but he nevertheless persists, right? There he says, oh, well, we must try to carry on. I answered him that I did not pretend to be acquainted with the commercial value of things, that since he, as a merchant, told me there was no commercial value in them, right? And wasn't he right? Wasn't Mauve right about that? I did not want to contradict him or to deny it, that I personally attached more importance to the artistic value and preferred to interest myself in nature instead of calculating prices and fixing commercial values. I spoke to him about the price. So just in a general sense, this whole letter is really about money, right? Or not getting money that he thought he was due to him in terms of his art. That's going to be your lot in life, my friend, for the next 7 years, right? He says, could not give my things gratis for nothing. This was because, like all other human beings, I have my human needs, wanting food and a roof over my head, and so on. Now, I must say, if I can just indulge my own experience briefly, as a journalist, as a freelance journalist, I would sometimes give my give my work and give my effort, not for money, but for in a trade scenario. So, for example, quite often I would stay in a hotel or at a B&B or wherever, and instead of being paid to write a review and to photograph the place, I would get as payment free accommodation or a free meal, right? And sometimes people would approach me, and I wouldn't be the only one. There'd be a lot of other freelancers that would experience the same thing, and they would say, "Can you take photos for me and can you write for me, but for nothing?" Right? And then you'd say, "Are you crazy? This is how I earn a living." And they'd be like, "But this is a great opportunity for you to get your name out there." And you'd say, "Trash. This isn't a great opportunity. This is a bad opportunity. I'm not going to take these photos for you for nothing. You're either going to pay me, I've got to get something out of it. It's my job." And they would be, "No, no, 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 no. You need your name to be out there. This is an opportunity for you, and you should do it for nothing." And anyway, at one point, I was part of a freelance association. You'd get these complaints all the time. And you would also get complaints of freelancers who would take up these opportunities and they would say, "Yes, I don't have any work, and this is better than no work, and I do need to get my name out." And then other freelancers would say, "Because you did that work for nothing, now more and more people expect you to do that work for nothing because somebody else did it for nothing," right? And so, you also sometimes get a freelancer who would say, "Okay, you don't know the kind of work I do. I'll do the first job for you for nothing, and then after that you can pay me." And what they would do is they'd make that arrangement with several freelancers getting all the work for nothing, which would make it harder for other freelancers. Another thing that would happen is a freelancer would then offer a big discount. They'd say, "Okay, instead of you paying the full price, you can pay half the price." Then when the next freelancer comes along, they say, "Well, we're only going to pay you that much," right? This is the kind of thing that can happen in the early days if you don't stand up for yourself, and if you get caught up in that whole thing. And that's also how I got out of the whole photojournalism thing. Sometimes I made a really good living, but other times there were so many freelancers that someone just turned it into a bidding war, and they were like, "Oh, I can get that much cheaper, so I'll use that person." And then it becomes like all the portfolios that you built up, all the magazine articles, all the names that you built up means nothing. And I have to say, I'm going to finish up in a second. I have to say that coming into the world of YouTube as an ex-journalist, it's very odd how it seems like people on YouTube don't actually care about your background. They don't care about your reputation. They don't care about your education. It's just like, how frequently are you putting videos up? And it's just quite shocking. It's like how hard I worked as a journalist to make a reputation. And now suddenly you're in 2021 or 2022, and it's like, well, if you just put up content enough, that's enough. Just like frequency and volume is sufficient. And it's like it shouldn't be like that. Doesn't credibility matter, right? And I think the answer is it does matter to some people, but it really doesn't matter to a whole bunch of people, right? And this is in a way what Van Gogh is struggling with, and rightly so. He can't just snap his fingers and be a saleable artist. He's got a lot of work to do. But the problem is he's quite old, right? And anyway, that is the sort of Damocles that is sort of hovering over him his entire life. Is you've got to prove yourself. One of the things that I think Van Gogh failed at, was marketing himself as an artist while he was alive. Now, the fact that he was so fascinated and caught up in the whole Dickensian thing meant that by definition he was going to market himself as a downtrodden second-class citizen. And people that want to buy art want to think of an artist as someone who transcends his circumstances, someone who's got this sort of magical conduit into the divine. And so someone who seems to be struggling, it's like, I don't want to buy a struggling artist's work. I don't want that. But I'm talking about when he's alive. Of course, when he's died, that whole struggle imbues it with some other kind of magic, right? The blood, sweat, and tears is now imbued. All of that life struggle is now part of the art post-mortem in a kind of a sick way. But anyway, that then gives his art credibility. Just a weird way that we imbue humanity into one another, wouldn't you say? Yvonne Phillips says, thanks a lot for that, Yvonne. Thanks, really appreciate that. She says, all in the Van Gogh drama gossip about each other, to each other, and with each other. Yeah. Karina says, it is the same as in my profession as a guide. Do it for free or reduced rates, and you pull down the tariffs in the region for other guides. Okay. So anyway, he goes here and he says, I have my human needs, wanting food and a roof over my head and so on, and that I considered it my duty to adjust these relatively insignificant matters. But I told him that I did not want to impose my work upon him against his wishes, and that I was willing to send him my, new drawings. Now, something that I think you've got to think about is, doesn't Van Gogh feel any guilt about imposing and burdening his brother with all of his demands? You know, like for him to say, all I need, Theo, is 150 francs a month, every month, for years. That is quite a big burden. Maybe Van Gogh, based on what's happening right now, maybe he imagines this isn't going to be so difficult, right? Maybe imagines his artistic journey is not going to be that tough. Well, it is. It's going to be much, 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 much tougher than he can imagine, right? But perhaps that is what convinces him not to, let me put it another way. Maybe because he does truly, sincerely think that he's going to find success quite soon, right? And quite soon being 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now at the most, but definitely within a year and a half, right? So I'll impose myself on my brother, and then it'll all be worthwhile for everybody, right? That's probably how he thinks about it. He's not just thinking, I'm going to just treat my brother like an ATM until the end of time. I don't think he's that kind of person. And truth be told, I have gone into the archive of letters. I have checked on that particular question, and the answer reflects quite well on Vincent. But I'll let you guys know about that when we get to that. So, but I think it's worth thinking about that. He truly does feel a bit uncomfortable with what he's doing, but he's also doing what is important to be doing, which is believing in himself. Self-belief is really important for an artist, especially in the beginning, when that self-belief is not really justified. He goes on to say, I'm practically sure that what will happen is that this behavior of mine will be considered ungrateful, rude, and impertinent, and that as soon as the subject is raised, I shall be reproached in this way. Your uncle in Amsterdam, who meant so well by you and was so kind to you and gave you such help, in consequence of your pretentiousness and obstinacy, you treated him so ungratefully that it is your own fault, etc., etc. And that is a sense that one gets from Van Gogh that feels to some extent accurate, that he does seem to be ungrateful, right? He does seem to be ungrateful, but on the other hand, we know how hard he's working and also how hard he's going to work. I think what people don't realize is that the side to Van Gogh that is the other side of the story is that he also wants to have a life. He also wants to have a wife. He also wants to have a girlfriend. He also wants to have a family. And you might say that's selfish or ungrateful or unrealistic under the circumstances, and it is. It is unrealistic. It is selfish under the circumstances, right? But it's also Van Gogh kind of, you can say it's him being narcissistic, but I would argue that it's a kind of healthy narcissism. He just applies it in a way that is strange. But what he's kind of just saying is, I'm insisting on having just a little bit of joy, even if it's inappropriate, even if society disapproves. I've had enough of suffering, and I'm going to continue to suffer. I've had enough of people disapproving of me, but I'm going to kind of ignore some of it. I just want a little bit of my life to start now that I'm 29 years old. And I remember when I was 30, 31 years old, and again, sorry if I'm indulging in my own story, but I do think it's relevant. I remember when I was, I think I was, so it was, I was probably about Van Gogh's age, about 29 years old. It was around about 2001, 2002. And at that stage, I had a degree and a postgraduate diploma. And my three best friends were all married, and they'd sort of sailed off into the sunset. They had beautiful wives, beautiful lives. And I was like this late start, and I was like, I'm 29 years old, and what can I say about my life? And I kind of had some pretty big plans, and I went across the country pitching business plans and so on, only to be told you either overqualified or you don't have any experience, right? And what I eventually did was I said, F this country, I need to get the heck out of here. Like I'd gone all over the country pitching business plans, going to banks and businesses and everything, and I, a full on business plan, and then I eventually left South Africa for South Korea because I was like, I need to be in a different environment where I can at least work, and so that is what I did. I can tell you now that 10 years later, the business plan that I drew up basically, what's the word, came into being through a separate thing that happened. So I was actually 10 years ahead of my time. I'm not going to bore you with what that plan was all about, but it was a delivery business which 10 years later came into being in South Africa. At that time, it didn't actually exist, but no one could kind of understand what I was talking about, or they did understand. There was one particular business that said it's a great idea, but we are B2B, not B2C. We're not business to consumer. You've found a opportunity in the market, and then anyway, and then I just ran out of patience for the whole thing, and I was like, get me the hell out of here. And I went to another country, and then I worked there, right? But I'm just saying, I understand that feeling of, I've got to get my life started. I can't wait for someone to give me a ticket and give me permission to start living and working. So I can understand that sense he gets from him. But I think the mistake he made was that he should have found another opportunity. He should have worked on the side or something. Of course, he had Theo as a benefactor, right, which I think helped him. Onesie says, great insight, Nick. I started to feel very negative about Vincent. Okay, so he goes on to say, my friend Rappard, in point of fact, I don't know whether I ought to laugh or cry over such an incident. I think it's so characteristic. Of course, those rich merchants are the decent, honest, righteous, loyal, sensitive fellows. And we poor devils who sit and draw in the country or in the street or in the studio, at times very early in the morning, at other times in the dead of night, at times in the blazing sun, at other times in the snow. We are the fellows without finer feelings, without practical minds, above all, without distinguished manners. All right, so be it. So there is really raging in a way, but in quite a polite way as well, about the kind of the hypocrisy and the unrealistic standards of the art kind of bureaucracy, right? Okay, Timmy, come. Then he says, this uncle of mine in Amsterdam also told me with great aplomb that de Groo was a really bad man. You'll understand how much this altered my opinion of Father de Groo. The only thing I said, and to which he has not made an answer up till now, this noble merchant, was this. And it translates to, and yet it seems to me that it is much less a question of earning than of deserving. Oh, well, I only mention it to open the safety valve of the engine a bit, so to speak. So what Van Gogh is actually saying there through those words is that he's actually feeling stressed. He's actually feeling pressure. He's actually feeling a kind of emotional pressure cooker situation. And he writes this letter to Rappard to kind of vent, right? He's actually kind of being a bit of a psychologist himself, where he's saying, I'm under pressure here. I'm dealing with, a difficult situation, specifically in terms of art. And in order to find equilibrium, I need to just vent a little bit, which he does. He says, if I don't do that, I might go on bearing a grudge because of the whole affair, whereas there's nothing I wish more than to stop thinking about it and to forget it altogether. But these fellows always begin by being so nice. At first, they're so charming that when it comes to the point, one is all the more flabbergasted. Adieu once more, many thanks, and believe me, ever yours, Vincent. Now, Vincent's a little bit, what's the word, convenient in terms of his accountability here. There's another reason why Mauve isn't terribly impressed with him. It's not to do with his art, it's to do with his lifestyle choices, right? That's the other part. And Vincent may say, that's got nothing to do with you, but how realistic is that? Yvonne says, I wish Vincent would have made the realization you made, Nick. Maybe he would have if he had lived in our generation rather than 150 years ago. Susan says, that's very cool. Okay, so I think this next letter takes us to the hospital. So we go from the 5th of June to 8th or 9th of June. There we go. So this is actually a hospital in The Hague and is in 4-class ward number 9. Now, that's actually something I wanted to talk about. I don't know if I'm going to do it in this live, but I do want to talk about it, and that is the stress of going from one class to another. And I can also share personal experience with that, where you are born into a particular class only to realize reluctantly that you no longer fit or qualify or can participate in a particular class. And that is a very humbling, frustrating, troubling, and to some extent horrifying place to be, where you realize it's not something that happens to you instantly. It's something that sort of dawns on you. You realize, wow, I actually don't fit into this class anymore. I'm actually in another class, right? I can't rely on this particular, let's call it, stratum of privilege, because it just doesn't, I'm not considered part of it or whatever. It's a very stressful, horrible, ugly treadmill to be on. But I've also got to say, the sooner you realize you're not in that particular stratum, the sooner you can kind of get busy creating traction in the strata that you do belong to. So the longer you try to belong to LSM, that's what we learned in marketing. I think it stands for, is it lifestyle measure? Let me just quickly Google it. I know they called it LSM. I haven't heard it referred to in a long time. Living standard measure. I don't know if it's used in other countries besides South Africa. But anyway, that's what we learned in marketing. But you might find that you actually now in a different cultural level where everything is very different to what you knew when you lived in a particular suburb, perhaps when you're growing up. And that's another thing that Vincent may think, oh, I'm just going to be a blue collar dude. Well, you're a blue collar dude trying to convince kind of white collar people that are quite wealthy and who belong to a sort of cultural elite, that you're trying to exert power in a milieu where you have no power, and you're never going to have any power because of how you present yourself, because of how you act, and that is just the way of life kind of thing. And then only to have all of that turned on its head, 100 and something years later. Robbie Robbins says, I'm not keen on people being separated into classes. I'm not either. But I can tell you, when you realize it's happening, it is nevertheless reality. You might say, I don't like thinking about it, or or you might be in denial about it. But when you realize it's happening, it's definitely discomforting. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys about that maybe in the next episode. Karina says, from riches to rags in a way. Yeah. Okay, so what I think is really interesting here is that I think although he had gonorrhea, I think the stress of work and the stress of being committed to an asylum by his family, despite his words, despite fighting words, I also think the stress of his brother possibly. Bear in mind, his brother only sent him rent money, like at the last possible moment. The stress of losing his own home, I think, is part of why he got so sick. And of course, his behavior. I mean, sleeping with Sien, you had to pick it up somewhere. But I think he was under a heck of a lot of stress, which if you read his letters, you don't really, you seem to think that he's managing, but actually he is turning himself inside out, right? To defend himself from all comers, right? So anyway, it comes to a head by the first week of June, and he thinks he's going to be in hospital just for 2 weeks, but he ends up being in hospital for the rest of June, for about 3 weeks in June, right? So this is what he writes from the hospital to Theo. Now, bear in mind, the title of this episode is not the title, I suppose the title, but also the poll is, was Van Gogh a hypochondriac? And it's almost equal amounts saying yes, no, and sometimes. But this is really where you want to look at it. Does Van Gogh here exaggerate how he's feeling, right? So as we go through this letter, which he writes from hospital, do you think he's exaggerating how he feels? Or do you think he's minimizing how he feels, right? So he says the following: Dear Theo, if you come here towards the end of June, you will find me at work again, right? If you come at the end of June, I'll be at work. But for the time being, I'm in hospital. So he's kind of already assuring his brother, although I'm not working right now, I will be back to work very soon. Don't worry, right? He says, I shall only stay in the hospital for a fortnight. Well, there is minimizing how bad things are. As I say, he will end up being in hospital a little bit longer. Obviously, his condition was worse than he's letting on. He says, for 3 weeks, I've been suffering from insomnia and low fever. Well, has he mentioned any of that in his letters? I won't say he hasn't mentioned any of it, but he certainly hasn't been saying, wow, I'm so stressed and I can't sleep and I'm not feeling well. He hasn't been emphasizing that. Instead, he's been emphasizing, I can work. I have been working. I'm working hard, etc., etc., right? Then he says, passing water was painful. That's giving you a little bit of an idea where the trouble is, to put it mildly. Then he says, and now it seems that I've really what they call the clap, but only a mild case. Do you think it's really a mild case if he's in hospital? Do you think it's a mild case if he's in hospital for 3 weeks? Right? Again, do you think it's hypochondria, or do you think it's the opposite, that he's actually quite a tough fellow, he's quite resilient, he's not a baby, he's not got self-pity, he's not exaggerating his symptoms. If anything, he's underreporting them, right? Again, what I'm trying to reinforce is this idea that this person that everyone thinks was a madman, was suffering from depression, was, you know, struggling with anxiety and whatever, you know, who committed suicide, is actually quite a resilient guy. He's been through so many tough trials. The trial that he was faced with in the summer of 1890 was mild compared to all the others, right? And also, when things are happening to him, he communicates it, right? So why didn't he communicate the toughest trial of all, right? He also doesn't exaggerate to Theo. He doesn't say, Theo, I'm so sick, please help me, please send me money. If anything, he's saying, it's not that bad, I'll be fine, I'll be back to work, right? He says, listen, can you hear someone snoring? He says, now I have to study quietly in bed here, swallow many quinine pills, and also have injections now and then, either of pure water or of alum water. So it is as harmless as can be. I think part of the treatment for gonorrhea is also zinc, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, he says, therefore, I can't imagine that he could literally just be treated by him being injected with pure water. Anyway, he says, therefore, you need not worry at all about it. I think probably a big part of the treatment he was getting in hospital was literally basically resting, not working, getting enough sleep, so because as far as I know, gonorrhea is a bacterial infection. So all you've really got to do is get your immunity back. It goes on to say, you don't need to worry about it. One must not neglect such things and should have them attended to at once, because neglect only aggravates it. Probably also in hospital, besides getting enough sleep, is probably also going to be getting a better diet than he's been getting at home. Then he says, witness Breitner, who is still here, though in another ward, and perhaps he will leave soon. He doesn't know I'm here. You will do me a favor by not talking about it, for people sometimes exaggerate so, and gossip makes things seem worse. You're the only one I'm telling exactly what it is. You needn't keep it a secret if anyone should ask you directly, and at all events, you needn't get alarmed about it. Then he talks about what it's going to cost. It's going to cost about a month's rent to be in hospital for a fortnight. He says, of course, I had to pay a fortnight in advance, 10 guilders 50. So half the money earned for all his drawings are now going to this hospital treatment. He says there's no difference as to food or treatment between the persons who are free patients and those who pay 10, 50 guilders. There are 10 patients in a ward, and I can only say that the treatment is very good in all respects. I do not feel bored at all, and the rest and the thoroughly practical, intensive medical treatment do me good. If it is convenient, be so kind as to send 50 francs about June 20 to the above mentioned address, but not by registered mail. You know that I received 100 francs on June 1st, so then I shall be safe no matter what happens. If I have to stay longer, I will pay extra and stay on, and if not, I shall have the money to start work again. Of course, I should prefer to start working in a fortnight, and within a fortnight, I shall certainly be longing for a walk in the dunes. Sien comes to see me, that's in hospital, on visiting days and keeps an eye on the studio. Now you should know that the day before I came here, I received a letter from Mauve in which he wrote a whole lot about the interest he has in me. That seems to be quite sarcastic. So what that is showing you is that the day before he's hospitalized, he gets a letter from Mauve and he's very stressed about Mauve, right? Yvonne says, Vincent is fighting on so many fronts. Physical illness often takes even the strongest man down. Well said. Well said, Yvonne. Well said. He says, Mauve wrote a lot about the interest he has in me, and which he says Tierstig has also shown me, but he did not approve of my having been so ungrateful to Tierstig for his marks of sympathy. It may be so. I'm lying here calmly and quietly enough, but I can tell you, Theo, that I should certainly lose my temper if some person or other came to see me again with the kind of interest Tierstig has shown me on certain occasions. This is one of the few times that Van Gogh talks about actually getting angry, like losing his temper. You kind of get the sense that although he seems to fall in love at the drop of a hat, um, besides that, is quite emotionally controlled, certainly in his letters, but he seems to be quite in control of himself otherwise. Do you agree with that? He goes on to say, and when I think I pushed his interest so far as to have the nerve to compare me with an opium smoker, then I'm still astonished that for my part I did not show him my interest in the form of a go to hell. So there you have it. Tierstig said to Vincent, you're just like an opium smoker, right? You're like a drug addict. You living with this pregnant woman, you are someone with the self discipline, this the what do you call it? You've got the, what do they call it when you yeah, it's sort of like self discipline. I'm just trying to think of a different word. Let's see if I can find a better reference than that. It's sort of like your ability to delay gratification. It's self-control, self-mastery, restraint, willpower, right? So, but within the context of someone who's a total hedonist. And so they are starting to think of Vincent that way, as someone who is like in a brothel or something, smoking opium and sleeping with whomever. Now, the irony is that that is the final destination in a way for Van Gogh, certainly in 1888, and maybe even before that, that as an artist, him and Gauguin in all are going to be kind of in that setting. And you might want to replace opium with is it quinine or alcohol, but nevertheless, he is going to end up as the sort of hedonist artist. And although he is disgusted by the accusation here, that is the route that he ultimately takes, which I think is quite ironic. Does that make sense? Anyway, so he says, I'm amazed that I didn't tell him to go to hell. Then he says, speaking of smoking opium, the comfort and the luxury, the kind of glory in which Tierstig moves, and a reasonably strong dose of flattery people in general administer to him, these are the things which drug his honor more than he himself is conscious of. In short, notwithstanding, so you can see here he's in hospital, and Van Gogh is quite activated, quite antagonistic, quite aggressive, quite irritated, right? And this is part of the reason why he's in hospital to begin with, is because he's stressed out, because he's got quite a lot of people on his case, attacking him, criticizing him, undermining him, not supporting him anymore. Friends, people that he once considered friends, are now critical of him, and you could argue with fairly good reason. Susan says a big slap in the face when compared to an opium smoker. He goes on to say, in short, notwithstanding the superficial elegance of his behavior, notwithstanding his superficially refined manners, his nice clothes, etc., all of this is Van Gogh raging in a way against this perception that someone belongs to a higher society than he does, and it's true, they do. And what he seems to not be realizing is, guess what? High society does look down on low society. Guess what? Low society does look up with a mixture of admiration and what's the word? Resentment. You know, the different classes look at one another with kind of mutual revulsion. The lower classes want to be where the higher classes are, but they see them as greedy, as fat cats, you know, as capitalistic pigs, right? And the wealthy look down at the poor as whatever it is, lazy, um, criminals, whatever it is. I'm just saying that there's mutual dislike between the classes, and Van Gogh is like, I don't understand what's wrong with me. What's wrong with you is that all you are is a peacock. You just dressed in nice clothes, and meanwhile inside you've got a ugly heart, kind of thing. Of course, it doesn't quite work that way. People who, and I'm talking about making money in an ethical way, have obviously proved themselves in some way, whereas someone who never has any money, like Van Gogh, in some way still needs to prove themselves. And I think if you don't believe that, if you think a poor person who never makes any money doesn't have anything to prove, maybe, but maybe not as well. Maybe not. But I think Van Gogh will, I mean, I think that's a question you can kind of ask is, does Van Gogh feel he's got anything to prove? And I think he keeps insisting that he doesn't, but he ends up painting like a madman. He paints a lot because he senses that he does have something to prove. He is trying to sell something. He is trying to make a point. And then all credit to him, he does make a point posthumously, doesn't he? A big point. I mean, this self-portrait that he did as an afterthought on the back of Head of a Peasant Woman is worth now apparently £100 million, right? And here he's quibbling over 20 guilders, right? Anyway, he says, without doubting for a moment that his honor is a clever man, another question is important to my respecting him. Is he a good man? So he's kind of saying, despite the nice clothes, are you a good person? And look at me, I'm wearing these kind of clothes. I'm a good person. Isn't that good enough? He says, that is to say, a man who does not nurture hatred, grudges, chicanery, sarcasm in his mind merely on principle. That is the question. I did not answer Move's last letter, nor shall I. So you can see there's a heck of a lot of negative energy in this letter. Well, that is why he's sick, right? That is definitely why he's sick. He says, however, I appreciate his saying that sometime he will buy from me again out of interest, especially if he means it, which remains to be seen. Of course, a letter from you would make me very happy these days. Sien is getting ready to go to Leiden. I often think of her. I'm expecting her now. I hope she will pull through safely. I fought against being ill as long as I could and continued working, but at last I felt it was urgent to consult a doctor. So he knew he was sick and he was trying to sort of push it back, and eventually was overcome by illness. He says, but this morning he told me again that it would soon get better. I'm the less sorry to be lying quietly here for a few days, seeing that in case I should need to, I should be able to get an official statement from the doctor here to the effect that I'm not the person to be sent to Giel or to be put under guardianship. So that's quite interesting. It seems like while he's in the hospital, he's kind of going to get a letter saying you're of sound mind, which is definitely quite interesting. It makes one wonder is this a case of hypochondria? Is he actually sick, or is he actually there for that reason? He goes on to say, and if this should not be enough, another one, if I were to take the trouble from the medical director of the lying hospital at Leiden, a professor, he's saying he's going to get 2 letters from 2 different hospitals saying I'm competent, right? But perhaps those people who might possibly feel the urge to declare it, that it would be such a great advantage to society or to the family if someone like me were declared insane or put under guardianship, are such awfully big bugs that they know much more about those things than, for instance, the doctor here. Did you receive the 2 little drawings, a due, a handshake, and wishing you as much prosperity as a man can stand? Yours, Vincent. And then this postscript. I feel obliged to tell you, so he's still very much aware of the whole guardianship thing. And do you remember in the previous letter, he said something about, I hope you're not going to take advantage of me, or I hope the family's not going to take advantage of me while, if I'm ill, right? Remember him saying that? So you can almost see that he could tell that this was coming, that his health was possibly deteriorating. Um, so anyway, it goes on to say, I feel obliged to tell you again that in case they want to attempt something like putting me under guardianship on physical grounds, the precedent of the Giel affair would make it awkward for the family suddenly to take a different stand and base their action no longer on physical but on financial grounds. Such things don't cut any ice. But I repeat, I hope things will not be pushed as far as that. But please write soon, for I'm anxiously looking forward to a letter from you. You understand, Theo, that I don't talk about family matters with either the physician here or the professor at Leiden, only seeing that I'm being treated by the former and seen by the latter. If I needed it, one word would get me a statement from these gentlemen, contradicting a possible differing statement by some persons you spoke of. So it's really interesting that at the very end of his letter, he's kind of saying, just try and put me under guardianship. Well, I've got that taken care of, right? Okay, so now we go from 8 or 9 June to 10th of June. Dear Theo, few things have given me so much pleasure recently as hearing things from home, which to a certain extent set my mind at ease about their feelings towards me. So you can imagine Theo getting this letter saying, I'm in hospital. And by the way, if you're going to try and put me under guardianship, blah, 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 you can imagine them wanting to be less aggressive towards him. You can imagine them saying, well, we better back off. Things are getting quite serious here, right? And also, Vincent being in hospital, someone's got to pay for that as well. Then he says, Sien came to me Sien came to tell me that a parcel had been delivered to the studio, and I told her to go and open it and see what was in it, and in case there was a letter, to bring it with her. So I learned that they had sent a whole package of things, underwear and outer clothing and cigars, and there was also 10 guilders enclosed in the letter. So again, I ask you, do you think there's an element of hypochondria here? You might say no, you might say some. You might also say whether there is or not certainly worked out in his favor. He suddenly gets money, he gets clothing, even gets a cigar. He says, I cannot tell you how it touched me. It is much more than I expected, but they do not know everything yet. I'm just weak and feeble, Theo, and I need absolute rest to recover. So everything that makes for peace is welcome. So, in a weird way, whether deliberately or not, this was sort of a test. When Vincent is in distress, is his family, who are so disappointed in him, so to some extent threatening to do something to him, are they going to drop all that and support him? And the answer is yes. Ultimately, it comes from a good, kind moral family. Do you agree with that? Robbie Robbins says new underwear again. He probably needs to think about underwear when he's got a girlfriend, right? Then he says, I wanted to tell you the news about father and mother immediately because I thought it would please you too. Sien will probably go next Monday, for I think she's better off in the hospital now. She will be admitted about the middle of June. I think she's going to hospital in order to give birth, right? She wanted to stay here for me, but I wouldn't allow it. I wonder if that's true. I wonder whether she did want to stay in the hospital or whether actually she didn't, kind of thing. Just think about it. Sien is pregnant. She's maybe to some extent sick. She needs to be taken care of, or maybe that's how she feels. I want to be taken care of. I want to be looked after. And the dude looking after her is arguing with everyone and ends up going to hospital himself, right? Not much of a sort of guardian angel. Do you think of Van Gogh as a guardian angel figure? She's probably thinking, cheapest, this guy has got more problems than I do, right? And he's now got gonorrhea. I don't want to get gonorrhea back from him. Anyway, he says, I have books on perspective here and a few volumes of Dickens, including Edwin Drood. There's perspective in Dickens too. Good God, what an artist. There's no one like him. I think he's talking about perspective in Dickens's view of the world. I just want to see if I can bring up this book by Dickens. Well, there doesn't seem to be a terribly great. I suppose there are a couple of covers here that I can maybe share with you guys. Let's see if I can bring it up. So this is the book that Van Gogh's actually reading. There he refers to it, The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens. And you can see it's also got illustrations here. And then here's another one, not quite as well executed. Here's another one. Here is another one. It looks like it could be a crime story. Do you agree? It looks like it could be a story about some kind of crime. There's another one. Another cover. But let me leave it on this particular cover and then take you just quickly through the Wikipedia description of this book. And the only reason we're going into it is just to get an idea of what Vincent's thinking about based on what he's reading. So according to Wikipedia, it says it focuses on Drood's uncle, John Jasper, a opium addict, a choir master, a guy who is lusting after his pupil, Rosa Budd. Miss Budd has also caught the eye of the high-spirited and hot-tempered Neville Landless. Landless and Edwin Drood take an instant dislike to each other. Later, Drood disappears under mysterious circumstances. The story is set in Closterham, a lightly disguised Rochester. So you kind of have a opium addict who is lusting after his own pupil, and then there's a bit of a love triangle taking place, leading to some kind of unhappily ever after. So just in terms of the characters, there's Edwin Drood, who's an orphan. When he comes of age, he plans to marry Rosebud and go to Egypt, working as an engineer with a firm in which his father has been a partner. Rosebud is an orphan and Edwin Drood's fiancée. Their betrothal was arranged by their fathers. Then there's John Jasper, the choir master. He secretly loves Rosa. He frequently visits an opium den in London. Anyway, so this is what he's reading about. Then this is a book apparently about a crime. The killer is not revealed, but it is generally believed that John Jasper, Edwin's uncle, is the murderer. There are several reasons. Yeah, so I'm not going to take it any further than that. So quite interestingly, on the 7th of January 1914, so obviously this is beyond Van Gogh's life, but the Dickens Fellowship organized a dramatic trial in the King's Hall. So in other words, a fictional trial where they try to find out the answer to the mystery of this book. Anyway, if you're interested in reading more of the details of this, you can check out this on Wikipedia. Again, you might say, Van Gogh, what does that have to do with true crime? Well, more than you think. I've said that quite a few times already. Okay, let's continue with the letter. I think it's over here. He says, I hope my having to take a rest will have a good effect on my drawing. So while he's in hospital, he's reading this book on Edwin Drood, which is about having inappropriate relationships and doing inappropriate things. And he thinks he's a fantastic writer, doesn't he? He goes on to say, the view from the window of the ward is splendid. So this is the first time in quite a while that he's taking us into something that's picturesque. It's been quite a while that he's just describing a scene in front of him. And that's something I quite miss, because it gives you this moment out of time sketched in words by the artist, right? So here he says, the view from the window, and obviously it's the hospital window, is splendid. Yards on the canal with the barges loaded with potatoes. Rear view of houses that are being pulled down by workmen, part of a garden. And on the next, more distant, plain the quay with its rows of trees and street lamps. A very complicated little almshouse. That's I guess the equivalent to a pub or a beer garden, with little gardens connected to it, and finally all the roofs. The whole is a bird's eye view, which, especially in the evenings and in the mornings, is mysterious because of the light's effect, for instance, like a Racedahl or Van der Meer. But I may not and cannot draw it as long as I am so weak. So he's seeing something in front of him, and he's just got this incredible desire to capture it in some way. He's seeing this incredible scene, almost like a bird's eye view, into all of these little lives spread out under him. People's gardens, all the sort of minutiae of civilian life unraveling under him, and he just wishes he could draw it, but he feels like he can't because he's too weak. He says, I'm forbidden to get out of bed, but I cannot refrain from getting up to look at it every evening. You can imagine at night, there's something delightful and something magical about the candles coming on and these little bubbles of golden light with people doing their little things around it. And bear in mind, he is an outsider to all this. He's a poor artist living in a pretty bedraggled existence, and he's looking into this twinkling little universe that must seem to him quite bright and kind of beautiful. It's a beautiful life certain people are living, and he's just there's a sense of rapture about it, right? And so that's what he sees every night for 3 weeks. And meanwhile, he's reading this book about another life that is going on. Then he says, write me soon. Wasn't that parcel from home a surprise? And especially coming at a time like this, it made me more than happy. So he's really happy to get some physical package from home, a sign of, that although he's been the prodigal son, that his parents still love him and still um, want to take care of him. I must say, when I was in the Air Force, I got a big box full of food and books and whatever. That also meant a lot to me when I was in the Air Force. Um, anyway, it goes on to say, the rest cure does me good and makes me so much calmer and takes away that nervousness, which has troubled me so much recently. And the ward here is no less interesting to me than the third class waiting room. So another thing just to mention here is Van Gogh diagnoses himself. It's not somebody who says, well, you look sick. He diagnoses himself. He says, I'm not well. And he admits himself to hospital. Even though he knows he could be a burden on his family, and he is a burden on his family, he nevertheless says, I'm sick. I'm gonna admit myself to hospital. That's how rational, sensible, realistic, and in touch he is with himself, right? If he was a hypochondriac, you would imagine that he wouldn't need to be in hospital for 3 weeks. You imagine he'd be there for 1 day or 2 days or 3 days. It goes on to say, the ward here is no less interesting to me than the third class waiting room, but I may not and cannot draw yet. I hope you'll find time to write to me. Believe me, yours sincerely, Vincent. Then he says, I thought it's so nice that this came from home. So he's still talking about this package. I wanted to let you know at once. Of course, I do not need any more clothes now. I wrote home to thank them and to tell them I was here. You know the address is City Hospital 4, Class Ward 6, number 9, Brouwersgracht. I wonder if that hospital still exists in The Hague. Okay, so I think there's, how many letters are there left in June? 22, 28. Okay, so we've got 2 letters left, and then we're going to go from there to Nuenen, right? So we've got 2 letters left, and then we're going to skip 18 months of his life, which you may come back to at the end of the series, right? But try and you might be quite tired dealing with this, but try and just absorb as much as you can of these last 2 letters, because it's going to be a big jump after this. And the reason why I wanted to take it as far as this is, you see the pattern, you see that whole process of him getting stressed and what he does with it, and how he is actually psychologically a match for it, but physically his health actually suffers. So although he's able to deal with all that anxiety in terms of a mental game, his body actually gives out on him. But he's even then able to pick himself up and take himself to hospital and recover from that. And that in itself is a test. It's a test of, does my family still love me? Answer, yes. Will my family still take care of me even though I've screwed up so badly and now I need their help? Answer, yes. Even though I've said to my family, if you try and have me committed, I will take you on legally. Next thing he's in hospital, and they still support him. Karina says, I'm not tired but fascinated. Yvonne says that parcel was the best medicine. Yeah. Okay, so now let's go on to the last 2 letters. These are relatively short. So here we go. Dear Theo, I received your letter of June 12. So this is 10 days ago. So obviously it wasn't that well if it's taken him 10 days to respond. And I think at this point he's still in the hospital, right? He says here, a prolonged stay in the hospital was necessary. Anyway, so he says, thank you most kindly. I did not answer you before because I did not know what turn my illness would take. So obviously he was quite sick. He was so sick that even when he got the money from his brother, he felt like, wow, I'm actually too sick to ride. I need to rest. He was probably told to rest as well. He said, I did not recover as quickly as the doctor had expected. I have already been here more than 2 weeks, and I've had to pay for the next 2 weeks in advance. So perhaps if everything goes well, I can leave in 8 or 10 days. But in that case, I shall get part of my money back. Now, so again, just this is emphasizing just how sick he was, right? Now, this morning I spoke to the doctor and asked him if there's been some complication that would make things worse. He said no, but rest and a prolonged stay in the hospital were necessary. So this again is confirmation just how hard Van Gogh not only is working, but also how hard he's being driven by everything that's happening to him. This situation with Sien is tearing him apart in many ways. These arguments with Mauve are distressing to him. So in the same way that he's a difficult guy, he's also a sensitive guy. In the same way that he's a sensitive guy is also resilient in terms of psychologically. His body may not be that resilient, but his mind, do you see that? That his mind is pretty resilient. He goes on to say, I can assure you that I'm no longer longing. Let me read that again. I can assure you that I'm longing dreadfully for the sight of something green and for some fresh air. An experience like this makes one feel very weak and faint. Again, just out of my experience, when I was 7 or 8 years old, I was in hospital for about 10 days. And it felt like a month. In fact, when I got home after that time, and I was very sick, I had very serious gastroenteritis. I think my temperature went to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. I was in an oxygen tent. But the point I want to make is that I was in hospital for so long that when I returned home, my bed seemed to be much lower off the ground than I remembered it, because I was so long in hospital getting onto this bed that was high off the floor. It seemed like the proportions of my room had changed. That's how long it felt like I was in hospital. And so Vincent has that same experience. He experiences this feeling of, I need to see something green. I would need to smell fresh air, not the smell of antiseptic in these hospital wards, the smell of sickness, the smell of sort of detergent and clean sheets kind of thing. He says, I have to lie still almost all the time. I cannot draw, though I tried several times. It makes me too feverish. So that's quite incredible, is that he actually is lying in bed and it's actually too much effort for him to draw. And I've been in that situation where I've been sick. And I'm thinking, well, if you're sick and you're writing, what is that going to do? And then actually finding that that little bit of energy that it's taking to concentrate is actually too much, that you need to rest. So he says, I cannot draw, but I can read, right? He says, but I haven't any more books. Well, there will come an end to this sooner or later, so I must have patience. So that's giving an idea that it takes more out of him to draw, and you can kind of imagine that, than to read. Drawing is producing something, reading is, consuming something. Then he says, Sien is at Leiden, but I cannot hear from her until she is confined. What are the sufferings of us men compared to that terrible pain which women have to bear during childbirth? They are better than we are at patient suffering, but on the other hand, we are superior in some other things. She came to visit me regularly until the last day and brought me some smoked beef and sugar or bread, which I have to do without now, and it makes me feel very faint. But now I'm so sorry that I in turn cannot go to Leiden to bring her some extras that she might need, for the food one gets there is not particularly good. It gives me such a strange feeling not to be able to do anything and see the days pass so idly. I must say my heart really goes out to him when you think about them both being in hospital. She takes care of him and now he wants to take care of her. You really get a sense of their common humanity in the situation, don't you? Gathering Place, good to see you here. Good to see you. Gathering Place, we are halfway through the second last letter. And then once we conclude with the next letter, we are done with June 1882, and we're going to jump to the winter of 1883, which is when he's in Nuenen with his parents. And that'll be episode 24 and going forward from there. We spend about, I think it's a year and a half in Nuenen, but there's a lot of drama there, as usual. And then from there, he goes to Antwerp for a while. I think he's tutored again by Mauve and Van Rappard. That's when he produces the Potato Eaters, sort of in that space of time. And then from there, he goes to Paris. But then in Paris, the letters really dry up. Okay, so he says, it gives me such a strange feeling not to be able to do anything and see the days pass so idly. Sometimes I think I shall be able to do this or that, but then the weakness gets the better of me. So he's really sick. I'm very glad you were interested in the drawings I sent you. I worked so hard on them and on the ones for Mauve also. Those last days when I suffered much more pain and was much more depressed than since I've been here. So here he's admitting to being depressed, right? But he's saying I was depressed then, right? So it's not as though he can't say if he's depressed. He does, right? And what depresses him? Well, when the people close to him are arguing with him and criticizing his art and just being mean to him, right? Then he says, for I felt worse before I went to the hospital, long before. I just want to emphasize here that he does express himself when he's depressed. So why didn't he do that when he was in Auvers-sur-Oise? Does that make sense? By the way, I wonder where Stephanie is. We haven't seen her for a while. Now I want to tell you that I've had a letter from Rappard. Of course, I had sent him back the 250 guilders at once, and then he answered me and repeated what he had already said about my drawings in the studio, namely that he liked them and felt sympathy for them because of their style and sentiment and character. So he's kind of encouraging his brother, or talking up a big game that there is somebody who likes his work, even if Mauve doesn't. He says, Rappard suggested that if I had some more like them, I should send them to him, as he thought he might be able to find a buyer. You can imagine that this is what I like best. It does me so much good when people find some sympathy for my work. For it is so discouraging and dispiriting and acts like a damper when no one ever hears this or that is right and full of sentiment and character. So there's a rare admission that in a way you get the sense that Van Gogh is very, very tough, and that he can handle any criticism. And here he is actually admitting the obvious, which is that when you get a lot of criticism as an artist, it's discouraging, especially from another artist. When you get a lot of insults and meanness especially from another artist, it's a damper, stressful. He says, it is so cheering to realize that others feel something of what one has tried to express. Van Rappard also liked a few of the nude studies. For the first time in several days, I'm sitting up again and I feel something revive in me while I write. If I were only well again. So the idea you get here is that he may have written this fairly early on. He may have written this maybe 5 days later, and then he wrote this another 5 days later, right? Anyway, he says, if I were only well again, if I could only work here, how I should love to make some studies of the ward. So you get a sense that he has really gotten to love being an artist. He really starts to see what is around him translated into sketches. And I had a lot of that both as an author and as a photographer, where no matter where I went, I would stop and take photos. No matter where I went, I would be taking notes and seeing the narrative potential and seeing analogies and so on. That's when that artistic side really becomes welded to your identity. And so you can see that although his work's not awesome, it's not even that great, his identity is nevertheless to some extent in place. He says, if I could only work here, how I should love to make some studies of the wards. I'm now lying in another ward without curtains around the beds or cots, and there are peculiar light effects, especially in the evening or in the night. The doctor is exactly as I should wish. He looks like Some Heads by Rembrandt, a splendid forehead and a very sympathetic expression. So his own doctor is thinking of, wow, I'd love to paint your portrait. Now think about the jump from this moment to the portrait of Dr. Gachet, right? I hope to have learned this much from him, that in the future I shall try to handle my models the way he does his patients, namely by getting a firm hold on them and putting them straight away into the required position. It is astonishing how much patience he has, massaging the patients himself, rubbing them with ointment and handling them in different ways, infinitely better than a male nurse does, and how well he knows how to banish their scruples and how to make them do exactly as he wishes. So Van Gogh is kind of getting a confidence lesson from this doctor, right? He says, there's one old man who would have been a superb St. Jerome, a thin, long, sinewy, brown, wrinkled body with such very distinct and expressive joints that it makes one melancholy not to be able to have him for a model. I can imagine that Heyerdahl is pleased with such a reward. I still have to tell you that father came to visit me during my first days here. So that's quite a revelation, isn't it? He doesn't even begin his letter by saying this. So that's quite a moment. Even their father comes to visit him in hospital. He says, though it was only a short and very hurried visit, I was not able to speak about anything that mattered. I would have preferred his visiting me another time, when on both sides we could have enjoyed it more. So I think he was so weak when his father visited that he wasn't really able to communicate much. And I don't know if you remember, we did deal with their father's letter where the Reverend Van Gogh said, Vincent was glad to see me, but he did seem a little bit irritated. Do you remember that? So let me quickly go to that letter. It's just a couple of letters back. It's the next one. So here this was on the 14th of June. Vincent was somewhat surprised to see me. He was a little irritated, but I succeeded in bringing him back to a more normal mood and promised to come back the next day. So he was there at least 2 days. He said, he does not look bad. His pulse is calm and he's quite normal. He nurses grievances against Uncle Cor because he has not been very enthusiastic about his drawings. And then he saying the same thing he says here about Van Rappard. Then he makes this sort of general statement here. He always remains strange, and my expectations are not great. If only he does not go down more and more, if only he does not throw himself away on an unworthy creature. That's the way his father refers to Sien. He says he has always had a penchant for people of lower classes, and out of sheer cussedness and a feeling of loneliness, a man might get entangled in the wrong sort of ties. I don't know whether that is not true. I don't know whether that statement from his father isn't true. So anyway, that was just a reminder. We have dealt with that. Let's go back to what Vincent says about Dad visiting. Where were we? It's quite interesting. He talks about a letter from Rappard and how the doctor is, and then only after all of that does he talk about father. That's why I think this part of the letter is written. It's not all written in one go. It's written after a few days, right? Anyway, so he says, I would have preferred his visiting me another time when on both sides we could have enjoyed it more. So it's almost like he's wishing his father either visited him when he was in the hospital, when he was stronger. He said, this way it was very strange to me and seemed more or less like a dream, as does this whole business of lying here ill. Except for seeing her mother and for father, I've not seen anybody, which is indeed for the best, though the days are rather lonesome and melancholy. Involuntarily, I often think of much more gloomy and lonesome things are now than, for instance, when I went to Mo for the first time. It's quite interesting how little he actually mentions of his father. Basically, just this one paragraph, and of the paragraph, it just says it was a short and hurried visit, and then that's basically it. It doesn't really say anything else. Then he says that this guy Brightner has left the hospital recently. He says, I believe that the doctor in this ward is a little more abrupt than in the more expensive wards, so much the better. Perhaps they are less afraid to hurt the patients a little here than in the more expensive wards. And for instance, they often put a catheter into the bladder quickly, without ceremony or fuss. Quite a painful experience, I think. Well, so much the better. I think, and I repeat, I think it just as interesting here as in a third class waiting room. Again, when he talks about putting the catheter into the bladder, what's actually a bit more explicit than that. I'm not going to tell you exactly what that involves, but you can imagine that is definitely, given what he's got gonorrhea. You can imagine that it's a particularly painful and unpleasant experience that he's got to go through, and he doesn't. If anything, he talks about it in a positive way, saying that it's done without ceremony, and that's great, right? Then he says, if only I could work, but I must admit I have a book by Dickens and my books on perspective with me. I hope you're right again. You know the address is City Hospital, Brouwersgracht, 4 Class 6 Ward number 9. Adieu with a handshake in thought, and once again, many thanks for your faithful letter and what is enclosed. Have a good time, and believe me, sincerely, yours, Vincent. Again, I just want to emphasize, even when he's sick, even when he is compromised, look at how lucid and logical and polite and sensible his writing is, right? Then his postscript reads, I think that I was too nervous when Sien had to leave and that it caused a relapse. So when Sien had to go to the hospital, that stress also stressed him out and made him sick again. And bear in mind, Sien is ultimately going to leave him. Ultimately, all of this effort and all of this drama is going to be abandoned, betrayed, whatever, by Sien anyway. Okay, then he says, but there are moments when one cannot always keep calm. She is so alone there, and I should like so much to go and see her, for the days must be frightful for her. I think a lot of what he feels for Sien is a kind of projection. It's a kind of self-projection. I think a lot of, you could almost imagine that Sien, who is this pregnant prostitute, this person who's downtrodden and discarded, you can almost imagine that Van Gogh is the same way. He's pregnant with promise. He's pregnant with this living art, this throbbing, beating heart of art that's going to take the world by storm. And nevertheless, he's struggling to give birth to it. He's struggling to make his way, each day. And I think there's a little bit of projection into why he feels sorry for her. I think in a weird way, his sympathy for her is a kind of sympathy for himself. Not that he's a self-pitiful person, but in this way, it manifests. And I don't think it's any surprise that he ends up in hospital. Bear in mind, he had a nervous breakdown when he was in the Borinage. Well, this is almost the next one, right? Yvonne says, I wonder if Father went there to observe the state of Vincent's condition himself and also to decide about guardianship issues. I think they definitely decided that this was basically an emergency, like a family emergency. And if you think about his words, is that basically they were concerned about him, but realized that things were kind of going to be okay ultimately. But good point, Yvonne, really good point. Okay, so that concludes, or is there one more letter? I think there's one more letter. One more letter, and then we are done with June 1882. So this is Van Gogh to Van Rappard. Yawith, I want to thank you for your last letter, which I certainly should have done sooner if I had not been upset recently. The fact is, you know, that I did not receive your letter in my studio, but in the hospital, where I've been for 3 weeks now. So even this letter is writing from hospital. He says, therefore, your letter was doubly welcome to me during those days. And what you said about the drawings, which do not seem to have been very much to my worthy uncle's liking, pleased me doubly so too. Later on, I heard from somebody else that they were not so bad after all, and that he had not meant to speak so harshly. Whatever the truth may be, the fact is that while doing those drawings and later making some similar ones of the fish drying barns on the dunes, I caught a cold, complicated with fever and nerves, all of which seems to have affected my bladder, so that I could not urinate, which finally distressed me so much and was so painful that I came here. So there you get the backstory at last. That, remember, he said that he was going out at 4 o'clock in the morning. He told Theo this. He said, I'm going out at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then he also mentioned 5 o'clock in the morning. Well, doing that, and remember, he also said he was sleeping in the dunes with Sien. Well, by doing that, he eventually got sick, right? And I think the cold was the final straw to the gonorrhea. The cold was complicated by a secondary infection. Does that make sense? Okay, so then he says, then they messed about in my bladder with a catheter and so on, so that I'm now returning to a more normal condition, of which I'm very glad. For all that, I'm not cured yet. So imagine that after 3 weeks, he's still actually feeling quite sick. And he says, I don't know if I shall be able to go home soon or not. I hope it will be over in a week, but of course, such things take their own time. Again, rather than feeling sorry for himself, he says, it's very pleasant here in the hospital. So he's obviously resting, sleeping, eating quite well. He says, I'm lying in a ward with 10 beds, but as hard as I had to keep quiet, I've not been able to draw until today. And even now, it is only a very faint and feeble start. I cannot do what I want and penetrate to the core of things. It's quite interesting that is how he thinks of his art, that he's not just trying to draw a picture, he's not just trying to scratch on a piece of paper, he's trying to penetrate to the core of things. That's an extraordinary statement as far as I'm concerned. You know, like, I often think in my own writing, you know, I've got a lot of critics, a lot of people who think your work is self-published, it's worth nothing, you don't have any credibility. And maybe that's true. But privately, I think I'm trying to penetrate to the core of man. What is the science of man? What is the science of man today, like in the modern sense, but also spanning the ages? And to what extent does the criminal mind answer that question, right? To what extent is what is modern psychology something that has always been true, and to what extent is it modern? And is that penetrating to the core of us, like right now? Gathering Place says, when did antibiotics get discovered? I think it's around about this time, but that's not to say that it was discovered at this time. And by the way, it was in Paris as well, in France. Then he says, but now I'm allowed to go into the garden for an hour every day. And yesterday I started scribbling a little. Now, again, all of this harkens to when he'd be in another hospital in All, and he'd be in that garden, he'd be painting that garden. So, this whole thing of he has this experience with the doctor, and only later in his life would he paint a portrait of a doctor. It's all sort of life repeating itself. He says, and at least I'm beginning to look at things again, though at first I felt too rotten even to use my eyes. When I leave here, I shall go about my business very quietly for a while. Well, we shall see. What I especially want to praise here is the treatment. If I ever happen to fall ill again, I should as little hesitate to go to a hospital as I did this time. So he's kind of got a self-lesson for himself, is that if I notice that I'm not well, I will just go to hospital, right? And he does actually apply that lesson several years later. The asylum of Saint-Remy is a hospital of sorts. Yvonne Phillips says, the real substance of things must not be forgotten. Karina says around 1920, penicillin. Karina, don't forget about the whole rabies thing. I mean, that's how it sort of started. Antibiotics wasn't just invented, it was a process, right? Then he goes on to say, it is, in my opinion, it is infinitely more practical than being ill at home, at least under circumstances such as mine. So you kind of get the idea that he's been sick and struggling with illness for quite a while. Going by the way I feel, I'm almost completely recovered, but the difficulty is that by moving about too much, taking long walks, etc., I may immediately have a relapse, which happened to me last week. And but for that, I should be further ahead now. Now, in a way, when he has syphilis in the asylum, it's the same situation. If he recovers and he starts working, he has a relapse. And he did have relapses quite often in the asylum. Then he goes on to say, as soon as I have a number of drawings again, as for instance the ones of the fish drying barns or a charity court, I shall be most happy to send you some, which you may be able to sell. However, I shall not hurry, but rather wait until one of them turns out better than usual. For in that case, I prefer sending it to you rather than to Amsterdam, although I hope Amsterdam will come around again. And let us agree that if you do not succeed in selling it, you need not feel ashamed to return it to me, and you need not think it would discourage me, for such things do not succeed all at once. So whether it be the fault of my drawing or the fault of a possible buyer, let us agree on both sides that the miscarriage of our attempt, if it should fail, will not discourage us immediately. So he is quite realistic. He's saying, you know what, maybe I'm not going to succeed at once. Gathering places, so he has had both syphilis and gonorrhea. Well, right now he's got gonorrhea. He will have syphilis later on. And syphilis and gonorrhea are related in that they are both sexually transmitted bacterial infections, right? Just different bacteria. Okay, so this is the last paragraph of the last letter in June. As soon as I'm at work again, I shall write you at an early date. Once more, thanks for your letter, which I did not want to postpone answering any longer. Meanwhile, believe me, ever yours, Vincent. So, although this is the last letter, we're just going to look at the next letter. I'm not going to read it, but there he is, 1st of July, is back to his studio, and he says it's delightful to be better again, ... and so on. He has a carpenter's yard, and that's the first thing that he paints or draws or sketches when he gets back, right? And so that is it. That is as far as we're going to take it. I just want to see where we go to from here. The next letter we're going to deal with is this one. 5th of December, 1883, letter from Vincent van Gogh to Theo van Gogh, right? Let's just have a look at your comments to see where we are. Just read some of your comments. Yvonne says hospital gardens are often delightful. The gardens at Mayo Clinic in Arizona are amazing. I couldn't stop taking pictures. Corinna, how can you forget Louis Pasteur? Okay, well, I'm glad you checked that out. Do you guys want me to read this letter to, in other words, to make the jump from him in hospital to being at home? Do you guys want me to read this last letter? That should bring us to 3 hours. Or do you want to leave the last letter, this next letter, for episode 24? Just dealing with the question, was Van Gogh a hypochondriac? About the same. A lot of you say yes, some of you say no, some of you say sometimes. I think the question is, was he a hypochondriac in this instance? I think the answer is no, but it does seem like, maybe he went there to get a letter saying that he wouldn't be committed, but the fact that he was there for so long and he didn't draw, I think, shows that in this instance he wasn't a hypochondriac. Okay, so 2 of you have said yes, please. So I'm going to just read this last letter. Here we go. So Nuenen, 5th of December, 1883, about 18 months have passed, right? So he reads the following. Dear brother, perhaps you were rather astonished when I told you briefly that I intended to go home for a while and that I should write you from here. So when he says go to home for a while, it almost sounds like he's going to be home for maybe a month or two, or he's going to end up being at home for longer than a year. He says, and he's also acknowledging that I'm sure you're going to be surprised to find out that I'm at home again. Well, it is a big surprise, isn't it? After everything that has happened. And of course, he's not with Sien, right? We don't know how that unravels. We may find out in a kind of a postscript to the series. But now we want to find out, where does his art take him from here? Also, where is his love life? How is he going to indulge that aspect of his self living at home? And it's not a question of is he is. How's that going to go down, right? So he says, first I have to thank you for your letter of December 1st. So it takes him 4 days to respond to it, which I just now received here at Nuenen. For the last 3 weeks already, I've not felt quite well. So again, he's kind of a little bit ill. He says all kinds of little troubles arising from having caught a cold and also from nervousness. So here he's ill again, and one wonders whether the cold and maybe the gonorrhea coming back again, right? Then he says, one must try to conquer such a thing, and I felt it would get worse if I did not get a change. So for several reasons, I made up my mind to go home for a while. So part of the reason he's going home is because he's ill, right? In a weird way, he's going home in lieu of going to a hospital. Does that make sense? So he says, a thing which, however, I was very loath to do is not saying I wanted to go home. He was thinking that I had to go home. I didn't have any choice in a way, right? He says, my journey began with a good 6-hour walk across the heath to Sien on a stormy afternoon in rain and snow. And I think he was walking from Drenthe, right? So he did live in Drenthe, I think about 3 months. So the narrative that we left off with in hospital, he spends about, I think it's 15 months in The Hague after the hospital episode, and then another 3 months in Drenthe, and then he comes to Nuenen. So I'm just saying there's a little episode, there's a little window where he lives in another little town called Drenthe as well. Anyway, he says, that walk cheered me greatly, or rather my feelings were so in sympathy with nature that it calmed me more than anything. I thought that perhaps now my going back home might give me a clearer insight into questions of how to act. So what he's really talking about there is, what do I do next with my life, right? And bear in mind at this point, Van Gogh is 30 years old, right? And he is wondering, what do I do with my life from this point onwards, right? What should I do next? What happens next? Then he talks about Drenthe. He says, Drenthe is splendid, but one's being able to stay there depends on many things. Depends on whether one is able to stand the loneliness. So this is obviously a factor. And again, bear in mind, he's no longer with Sien. So Sien is out of the picture. And so what is back into the picture? Loneliness. The loneliness of the artist, the loneliness of the artist's journey. He says, I believe Father would consider that question settled by a conclusion drawn from an ordinary conversation. But for my part, I'm in no hurry to decide it. And for instance, I want to see what I think of it after having been here about a week or so. But for the present, I'm quite in the dark as to how to act in that respect. So I'm not quite sure whether he thinks he's going to be at home for about a week or so or not. But anyway, it ends up being there a lot longer than a week. He goes on to say, one by no means arrives at a satisfactory conclusion by thinking or speaking about the question. That's what I see more and more. At one moment, it seems more possible than at another. And for my part, do not drop problems suddenly, but keep turning them over in my mind, sometimes long after other people consider them settled. But boy, it is so difficult for me. It becomes so much a matter of conscience that I should be too great a burden to you, that I should perhaps abuse your friendship when I accept money for an enterprise which perhaps will not pay. Well, there you have it, right? If you think that Van Gogh is a selfish, shallow, superficial person who's just using his brother, maybe for a while there was an element of that. Maybe for a while he was doing that, but obviously he was thinking, I am going to succeed ultimately. And after a year and a half, he hasn't. And so he feels, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep asking you for money, right? He says, it becomes so much a matter of conscience that I should be too great a burden to you, that I should perhaps abuse your friendship when I accept money for an enterprise which perhaps will not pay. Again, isn't this a very lucid, rational, sensible person? Despite all of the sort of cacophony of chaos, despite all the nonsense, Van Gogh is ultimately quite sensible, quite practical, right? Quite unselfish in a way. He says, you write again about Moniteur Universal. Do you think my opinion too pessimistic when I declare it possible that within relatively few years, a number of great art enterprises like the Moniteur Universal, for instance, and others still more overexpanded will dwindle down, will fall into decadence as quickly as they came up? All art business that remained in touch with real art began to flourish within a relatively few years. But it became too much a money speculation. And so even now, I do not say quite, I simply say too much so. And being a speculation, why shouldn't it go, as with the bulb trade? You will say that a picture is no tulip. Of course, there's the widest difference. And of course, I, who love pictures and tulips not at all, am perfectly well aware of this. But I'm sure that many rich people who buy expensive pictures, for some reason or other, do not do so because of the art value they find in them. The difference which you and I see between a tulip and a picture is invisible to such people. They, the speculators and the pocheurs blasés and many others, would buy tulips now just as before, if only it were fashionable. He's talking here about how art is only art because it's fashionable, but art can also be art in lieu of itself, right? He says there are real serious connoisseurs, yes, but it is perhaps only a tenth of all the business that is transacted. So in a way, you kind of get the sense that Van Gogh is trying to draw down into an art that is for the people, art that is kind of universal in a sense. And didn't he, in a sense, achieve that? Bear in mind, Van Gogh's not just some kind of simpleton who comes around and paints. He's someone who was schooled as an art dealer, and he's talking to his brother, who's also an art dealer. So, in other words, his art knowledge is really sophisticated, and he's trying to answer the sophisticated calling in a simple way, in a way that's going to be soothing, almost like a prayer to the common person. That's, he knows what he wants to do, he just doesn't know how to do it. And it's going to take him quite a number of years to figure out the answer to that. But it is quite a impressive mission that he's set for himself. Does that make sense? Robbie Robbins says, sounds like he has lost some confidence. I think with that losing of confidence, he's gained insight into what needs to be done. He's gained a sense of humility on this grand project that he has in mind. Yeah. Lost confidence, gained insight. And often that's how it works. You gain insight not when you win, but when you lose, not when you get what you want, but you don't get what you want. Susan says a great selfless acknowledgement. Okay, so he goes on to say, of course, I could go on enlarging on this theme forever, but without insisting on it further, I think you will agree with me that in the art dealing business, there's much that in the future might prove to be empty air. The price of pictures now raised enormously may go down. If you ask me, can Millet and Corot go down? I say in price, yes. From an artistic point of view, of course, Millet is Millet, Corot, Corot, fixed like the sun itself, in my opinion at least. 5 years ago, I thought differently. I thought that, for instance, Millet would remain stable even in price. But since then, just because I see how generally Millet is completely misunderstood, since he has become less obscure and more widely reproduced, for instance, than when he was ignored, I feared he will never be appreciated by the public at large. And it is not sure that those who understand him best will have to pay so much money for his pictures later on as they must now. Rembrandt's work also went down in price during the periwig and pigtail period. I should like to ask you frankly, do you believe that the present prices will hold? I tell you frankly, I do not think so. Now, what is so kind of crazy about this, what is so crazy about this is you've got Van Gogh musing about prices of art going down for artists that he really respects, right? You have Van Gogh in a failure phase, and I mean, you could argue that his entire life he failed as an artist, but I think that's a bit harsh. I think the last 2 months were quite triumphant, and in fact, I'd say the last 2 years were quite triumphant in terms of his artistic career, right? But it's quite ironic to hear, to see Van Gogh writing about, with concern, great artists like Rembrandt and Millet, and is the price going to go down, when we know that his art is going to become some of the most valuable in the world and in the history of art. It's kind of an irony, isn't it? Gathering places, I think that's quite profound. Many times lessons in life come from grief, loss, and failures. Good point, Karina. Karina says he's speaking about other artists, but he himself would surpass everything. Okay, so then he says, at the same time, for me, Millet is Millet, Rembrandt is Rembrandt, Israel's is Israel's, etc. And I think he could add here, Van Gogh is Van Gogh, whether their pictures cost 2 pence or 100,000 guilders. Consequently, I do not give much thought to the art dealing business. I do so only when I think of you and when I want to ask you if you really can like it. If you will not see, especially later on, many things that are too distasteful for you to stand. You will say, one gets used to everything, or rather you will say, we must live on until our hearts break within us. Maybe so, I agree with you in this, but if our hearts' needs must break within us, we are still free to act in one way or another. As to you or me, we are what we are, and as we have enthusiasm for art within us, we should, each on his own way, stick to our opinion about Millet, for instance, even if the most absurd things happened. And what I find quite magical about this, what I find quite amazing about this is a letter written where Van Gogh has basically failed. You know, he has gone on this great journey, which sort of began with falling in love with Key Boss. He then complicated that journey by falling in love with Sien. And after a falling out with Mauve and everything else that followed, Tearstig as well, he ends up coming back home, sick again, a failure as an artist, and yet he's making these statements in a letter that have kind of are so profound, reading it, you know, like 150 years later, right? It's quite profound that despite him being a failure at this moment in time, when you translate that moment across 150 years, there's something, as I say, profound and incredible about it. But he wasn't to know that. He wasn't to know that in December, in his parents' house, writing this letter, right? That's what makes it really quite incredible and quite magical. And he talks about even if the most absurd things happened. Well, I don't think Van Gogh, I think Van Gogh would be the first to say, well, I couldn't sell any of my art when I was alive. The fact that my art now eclipses, I won't say all other art, but a lot of other art and artists, that is pretty absurd, right? Then he says, but I ask you, in case of a gradual decline in the enormous prices for pictures, how can the great houses make up for it, which yearly spend formidable sums on advances, etc.? Now, you've got to wonder, when he talks about enormous prices, what would he think of whatever it was it $90 million for the portrait of Dr. Gachet? I mean, you know, you can build about 50 mansions. I suppose if you really want big mansions, then I suppose maybe 20 mansions. You could build 20 mansions with that amount of money, 20 massive mansions. That's quite a lot of money. Is that an enormous price, or is that an unfathomable price, kind of thing? Yvonne says, what artist cares for the business of it? I suppose it's an interesting question. I suppose you could say an artist that cares about the business isn't a true artist, but I think all artists need to be somewhat realistic, as mercenary as that sounds. I think if you're an artist that doesn't care at all about the business of it, then you are gambling, I think. I think you've got to have a little bit of street smarts. I don't think you can have none at all. I will tell you as a writer that I can't stand the bureaucracy around writing, which is why I self-published virtually all of my books, which is why I shunned the magazine world, why I didn't want to work for editors or have other people tell me what to do. So I guess you could say that that's true of me. What writer cares for the publishing industry? Not me. But nevertheless, if you think of it a bit beyond that, have you got to think about your reader? Yes. As an artist, do you have to think about the person looking at your art? Yes. I think so. I think you do. I think you've got to think of the recipient, the the invisible consumer. I don't like the word consumer, but the invisible recipient that you are actually addressing. You do need to think about them sympathetically, sensibly, sensitively, right? It's a great question. It's a great question, Yvonne. And Yvonne, you an artist, so I would expect nothing less. Okay, so he goes on to say, um, enormous prices for pictures. How can the great houses make up for it? Formidable sums on advances, which have to be deducted from their profit. They will soon have to be contented with great deficits. Such trees do not fall at the first stroke, but they can moulder away inside and fall at last without one stroke of the axe, only by the wind when. I have no idea of the exact date. Just write me on this question in general. For instance, what do you think of the stability in the long run of an establishment such as, you say, Moniteur Universal is, or Petit, or Arnold and Tripp? I think these are art dealerships. I just want to go for a second to the letter that deals with this handwritten letter. I just want to quickly go to that letter. I think it's this letter. So this is the actual letter that he wrote to his brother. It's this letter here. There's another part of it. You can see some things crossed out there. Just out of interest sake, this is the letter that he sent his brother, the actual letter. Okay, so he goes on to say, I tell you frankly, I do not see how they can keep it up in the long run. I think such things must collapse, and I think it must be rather uncomfortable to assist at such a thing. I prefer to sit and paint by a peat fire. Then one feels only a certain, what do I care for the whole art dealing business, except that I personally think it very unpleasant to be short of money. So there's also a bit of wisdom coming through. I don't like not having money, right? He's found that out the hard way. And then he also talks about Paris. You always remained your own calm self in Paris, very simple and certainly cooler than a man like Tripp, for instance. You care to see things only as they are, saying his brother's very realistic. You, as well as I, cannot help analyzing. And even, Timmy, I think you must go down. And yet even you do not use your knowledge of a situation primarily to profit by it in spite of its difficulties. I mean, fishing in troubled water is not in your character. But I ask you frankly, how is it? Do you really believe Moniteur Universal will ask anything else of its employees than Goupil and Key does? There seems to be there seems to be a little bit of concern here that you might lose your job, Theo, where he says, "You are not the man for us. I believe other managers would think the same," right? He also says here, fishing in troubled waters is not in your character. I'm just saying there seems to be a little bit of a sense that Theo's job in Paris might be in jeopardy because of the kind of guy he is. And 6 years later, it sort of would be. 7 years later, he would not be very happy at Goupil, Theo. Anyway, it goes on to say, now, as for you, I think what is happening to you at Goupil's would happen to you in any other firm, and setting up in business for oneself at a time when a cooling off and decline in the market is to be expected is something which, in my opinion, one would not undertake enthusiastically. So all of these references seem to indicate that it has become clear to Vincent, for one, maybe Theo for another, maybe even their parents, that Theo is either struggling financially or that there might be some jeopardy surrounding his employability or surrounding his future, certainly at Goupil. Wow, Gathering Place says, let me put this up. Wow, thanks so much. Thanks very much for that. I greatly appreciate the time spent with everyone as we hear from the grave, the voice and thoughts of Vincent. Thanks very much. I hope you're doing okay, Gathering Place. We still want to see your picture, so when you will, change your profile picture so we can see you. Paddy, you as well. Trying to see if there's anyone else. Onesie, Robbie Robin. I'm a fine one to talk, but then my avatar isn't really needed. Here I am. Anyway, okay, let's continue. So here he asks him straight out, do you have confidence in the present times? Do you believe trade will remain at this high pitch? So maybe not. Maybe he's not that worried. It's kind of this way or that way, isn't it? If you believed it, I should respect your opinion and hold my tongue, but I do not know if you are aware that I do not exactly believe that the very big business will prove reliable. Do write me about this, then it will be so much easier for me to speak about it. Now, it may also be that Van Gogh is thinking, if his brother says things are going great at work, come and stay with me in Paris, because bear in mind, he would do exactly that about 3 years later, right? So bear in mind, think about the context. He's moving back home right now and he's saying to his brother, are things going to be, is business going to continue to boom for this foreseeable future? What do you say? Business is booming now. Is it going to continue to boom? Is it going to continue to boom? And if his brother says, yes, definitely, well, then can I come and stay with you? Right? And ultimately, that is exactly what he does. Right? Okay, so he says, if you believed it, I should respect your opinion and hold my tongue. But I do not know if you are aware that I do not exactly believe that the very big business will prove reliable. He says, I feel a little embarrassed with you just now, and I want you to know my possibly nervous opinion that in the first place, I do not believe those inflated affairs will last. And in the second place, though they might last, I should not like to take a part in them either directly or indirectly. Another question is, if I can provide for myself by doing anything here or there, I will not look such a gift horse in the mouth. If it proves to be my duty to do something or other, very well, I will not refuse the work, even unpleasant work. So what he seems to be talking about here is almost, you kind of get the sense that he's cloaked in failure and that he's kind of thinking, I need to find something else to do. I'm going to think about it for a week, and I might become a bricklayer or a carpenter or a farmer or something, right? I mean, he says here, I mean, there he talks about I'm disillusioned, but he says here at the top, where does he say? Besides he's not feeling well, but he also says, where does he say? Going home to give me clearer insight into questions of how to act. That's kind of a general way of saying I need to think about what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. I think I must stop being an artist. I think I must stop drawing. I think I must do something else. I don't know what to do, right? And so he now needs to decide to continue being an artist or not. What do you think he decides? So he says, I thought of you, brother, during that long walk across the heath in the evening in the storm. I thought of a passage, I don't know from what book. Two eyes were awake, brightened by genuine tears. I thought, I am disillusioned. Well, that is exactly what he is, right? He is disillusioned about his art. And if he, this is in a way Van Gogh's Luke Skywalker moment. I don't know if you guys remember the movie that a lot of people regard as the best Star Wars movie, The Empire Strikes Back, starts with Luke Skywalker nearly dying. It starts with Luke Skywalker in the snow, in peril, and he thinks he's dying. And in the midst of that, what appears to be danger and death and the end, he gets this vision: you must go to Dagobah, and you're going to have this incredible experience, and you're about to have your great destiny revealed, right? But it feels like, are you crazy? This is the end of my life, not the beginning. And that's exactly how Van Gogh feels. He's returning home. He feels like, okay, I tried the art thing, that didn't work either. Now I really don't know what to do, right? And it's at this point that all of the great legacy that is awaiting us, that the great history of this particular artist is hanging in the balance, where he is disillusioned, is at a very weak point. He's been unlucky in love twice in a row, and he's at a very low point, and he's feeling like, as much as he's been fighting, he's feeling now, I think I'm ready to give up. I think I must do something else, right? And in December 1883, it's essentially about 6 years before the end of his art career, because he dies. But at this point, 6 years before the end of his art career, is thinking of throwing in the towel, and he ends up embracing the art that he does embrace for 6 long, difficult, but also amazing years afterwards. That's also quite amazing, that at this vulnerable point in his life, he's thinking of throwing in the towel, and imagine if he did. And he went on to fight against the stream of disapproval, of discontent, of difficulty for another 6 years. That's a long time, isn't it? So he goes on to say, I am disillusioned. I thought I believed in many things which I now know are really sorry fallacies. So he's become even more realistic about reality, hasn't he? He says, I thought those eyes of mine here on this gloomy evening, wide awake in this deserted region, they have been full of tears at times. Why shouldn't these have been wrung from me by a sorrow that disenchants, yes, and disturbs illusions, but at the same time makes one wide awake? Do you see how Shakespearean he can be in the midst of his despair? That he writes with such poetic truth, right? It's quite amazing. You know, he's not only a artist with the paintbrush, he's an artist with words, isn't he? He says, I thought it's impossible that Theo is satisfied with many things that worry me. Is it possible that it is only my own melancholy which I cannot enjoy some things as I used to do? In short, I thought, is it possible that I take gold for tinsel? Again, this is a reference to him seeing the woods for the trees, him coming down to earth, him seeing the drudgery of reality and the hard work that lies in store for him. He says, do I call withered a thing that is in full bloom? I could not find an answer. Can you? Are you sure that there isn't a far advanced, inexorable decadence everywhere? Give me courage if you have courage yourself. But I ask you in my turn, do not flatter me. He's kind of saying, can you encourage me? Can you give me advice that is not flattering, that is not a compliment for compliment's sake? Can you realistically encourage me at this time of my life, right? And in this sense, this is where the power shifts in a way to Theo, where Theo must now decide, are you going to carry on being an artist? Should you carry on being an artist? And also, should I carry on, um, keeping the ship afloat, right? And that's also where the tragedy and the irony come together in a totally different sense as well. So he says, as to myself, I declare I believe that even if I became very clever, which I am not as yet, I firmly believe that I shall always be very poor. So again, he's saying to his brother, this is the situation. I'm never going to make it. How do you feel about looking after me? How do you feel about continuing to look after me? Should I carry on with this pointless art? Should I carry on with this pointless journey? What do you think? Karina says a hard landing in reality. Kathy says he had grit and was persistent. Right? You can't accuse him of being schizophrenic or being deluded or being mad. He's completely rational here. He's asking completely rational questions. He says, I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep out of debt. He said, those who are the coming men in Holland now, the Mastodons, Meestach, Israels, Blommers, Maris, and so on, will under no circumstances earn more than was earned in the past, namely during the past 20 years, for instance. So now he's really thinking about money. In the past, money wasn't really a big deal at all. Now it's a huge deal because now he's equating moneylessness with powerlessness, moneylessness with a lack of destiny, right? He goes on to say, not even in the case of cleverness, especially not then. One of the drawbacks of a period like the one which is approaching is that a time in which the prices are run up so high can be said to be put a lien on the future, which makes the future dark for posterity. You who are as clever as Uncle Vincent, for instance, will not be able to do what Uncle Vincent did. Why not? Because there are too many Arnolds and Trips in the world, insatiable money wolves, compared to whom you are but a sheep. Please do not take my making this comparison as an insult, brother. It is better to be a sheep than a wolf, better to be slain than to slay, better to be Abel than Cain. And I hope, or rather I am sure, that I am not a wolf either. Suppose that it's not just in our imagination, but that you and I are really like sheep among our fellow creatures. Now, what I find, this is just my personal feeling, what I find so ironic about this is Vincent is disparaging of the wolves in the art world, and Van Gogh's art itself would become a great wolf-like creature. And I mean that in the sense that there are so many books that are actually false narratives about Van Gogh. There are there are so many cottage industries out there that are like voracious wolves trying to make money out of Van Gogh. And in my opinion, cynically, they're making money, yes, they are, but not out of the authentic story of Van Gogh, but a twisted and warped version of what really happened. The mad, troubled artist, well, that's basically it. The tragic artist who commits suicide. And then, wow, that's really worth a lot of money, that story. And there's something wolf-like in that, imagine the wolf in the Disney and the Three Pigs, the saliva dripping off his fangs. As much as the Van Gogh story is like a fairy tale and quite cute and quaint, on the other side of that, you've got these voracious wolves that are being enriched by it. And some of it is through crime, fake and fraud and all that kind of thing. There's a diary of Van Gogh that I believe is fake. There are artworks that are said to be Van Gogh works that I believe are fake. There's a whole lot of them, right? Those are the wolves that are that he's talking about here, right? And I don't know whether one can't include Dr. Gachet in that sort of canine. I almost want to say canonization of the art industry, turning it into this, these wolves that are, getting, these hungry wolves that are getting what they want out of the art market. But anyway, that is what he's talking about. Hungry and false wolves. He said it would not be impossible that we should be devoured someday. And I wonder whether that's not true. Isn't that what ultimately happened to the real Van Gogh, that the real Van Gogh has been devoured? I had a conversation today with my brother, who's a big Van Gogh fan for a lot longer than I've been, who's got a lot of books on Van Gogh. And my brother said Van Gogh had schizophrenia. And I said, when did he have schizophrenia? Like, he didn't have schizophrenia his whole life. I mean, if you take his letters, where's there this delusion and paranoia in his letters, right? And so if you say, well, he did have schizophrenia, well, at what point did it manifest? And he said, well, he had episodes, right? And it's true, he did. But I said, what person who's had a lack of sleep and is under a lot of stress and has been kicked out of a town and who's drinking a lot isn't going to have a similar thing? And you can't say he had schizophrenia all along, just that his mental state was contingent on a certain stress level, and any person under another kind of stress level is going to act in a strange way. That doesn't mean you've got this or that label, this or that disorder, right? And I'm just saying how the Van Gogh narrative is so corrupted. It's exactly what he's talking about right here. He talks about we should be devoured someday. And isn't that what happened? And that is why I've made it kind of my personal mission. Obviously, only right now 24 of you care about it, and those 29 people who have reviewed my book. But I nevertheless feel I've got a point. And it's based on knowing Van Gogh. And if I was wrong, I feel like, if I was wrong about his psychology, if I was wrong about this whole idea of how did he die, you would imagine that wrongness would express itself somewhere in a letter. And instead, the opposite has been happening. Every letter we go through confirms more and more what I've been saying, that he's a rational, sensible, lucid, intelligent person, and also resilient. Every letter reinforces that rather than the opposite, right? Kathy says, a high-functioning one then if he was. So, Gathering Place, do you recognize Van Gogh, or do you recognize your brother in Van Gogh, or Van Gogh in your brother, based on what we're dealing with here? My brother thought that the medicine, which makes treatment quite difficult. Yeah, I know about that. If someone has that and they refuse, that they don't want to take medicine, it's quite difficult. I mean, what are you supposed to do? Force them, right? Anyway, let's finish up here. He says, well, this may not be so very pleasant, but I tell myself it is after all better to be ruined than to do the ruining. I mean, there's no reason to lose one's serenity if one should realize that one might have to lead a life of poverty. Do you sense that there's like a resignation here where there's almost a glimpse into his own future, where it's like, I've tried very hard, I've failed. If I continue with this, I could fail even further, which is what he does. And he says, he talks about realizing that he might lead a life of poverty, even if one possesses all the qualities, the knowledge, the capacities which make other people rich, right? If you think about that, that's exactly what he does. He ends up leading a life of poverty, even though he possesses the qualities, the knowledge, the capacities. That's another way of saying the talent, which will make other people rich. He doesn't become rich out of his own efforts. Other people do. The gâchets, the galleries, right? And he's in a way, this is so portentous. He's getting a glimpse into his own legacy here. And at what time does it happen? At the moment that he moves back home. And so that is why this is such an incredible, exceptional, and in some ways tragic journey, but also an amazing journey that despite anticipating defeat, he goes on this journey anyway. And despite the way this journey ends, he nevertheless produces this art that changes the whole world, right? Isn't that quite exceptional? It's not for him, it's for us, right? He says, I'm not indifferent to money, but I do not understand the wolves. That's how he finishes it off. I'm not indifferent to money, but I do not understand the wolves. Well, with a warm handshake, yours sincerely, Vincent. Then he says, if you like, give me an answer to some of these questions while I am here at home. I'm here to get some rest and to arrive at some decision. Talk about understated. He is going to get some rest. He is going to come to a decision, and that is going to determine the rest of his life's journey. And that is, as far as I'm going to take it, this is quite a long live, and yeah, 3.5 hours. But I think it was necessary to get to this point, to get through the Hague period, and to get now to the next phase of Van Gogh's journey. We may deal with this as a kind of a postscript to this whole old series, but I did want to sort of fast track it a little bit because we sort of know what's going to happen after this. I'm talking about after he comes out of the hospital, it's going to be more of the same, asking for money, dealing with Sien and all of that kind of thing. Well, now we want to go on to the next phase of his life, which is what does he do with his disillusionment? What does he do with his doubt? What does he do with the difficulty? And most important, how does he find some way back to his art, given the limits, the constrictions of home, the feelings his parents has? And I think the most interesting, in a soapy sort of way, aspect of this part is how does he have a love life while he's living at home? And the answer is he does. And the other part of the answer is it causes another fiasco. It causes his family to be embarrassed in a very direct way, and also his the community to start pointing fingers at his family, saying this isn't right. Stop your son from doing this kind of thing. And I've already looked at the next letter in the series. The expression he uses in that letter is just absolutely priceless. I can't wait to share that with you guys in episode 24. So look out for that. Karina says it was perfect and poignant to learn about this phase of his life. Patty says, will we ever get details about what happened with Sien? You will. I can tell you that Sien did ultimately take her own life. but she outlived Vincent. So I can tell you that. But we'll deal with the aftermath to this right at the end of this whole story. If you guys are still interested. Yvonne says, very persuasive, this Vincent. This is why Theo loved him so. Gathering Place says, yes, schizophrenia seems to appear in late teens and early adulthood. Perhaps the stress of leaving home. Onesie says, more acceptance than resignation, maybe. Well, he is quite resigned here when he says, you know, I have to arrive at some decision. So it's almost like he's already written off his art. Like I think I'm going to do something different. Bear in mind also, by going home, in a way, he's resigned the effort to break out of home and make something of his life. You get what I'm saying? I think there is some resignation going on here. To go home, I don't think you so much accepted your fate as you've resigned from the challenge, right? I think he does obviously want to live and have a life, and he wants to join Theo in Paris, but he's feeling disillusioned. And I think disillusion is very close to resignation. That's just my opinion. Paddy says, thanks, Nick. We don't want any loose ends. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. Did you notice that the power didn't go off? So that little bit of having faith in the randomness of the universe sometimes does pay off. Robbie says it's difficult to go back home once you have left. Yeah, he says he loathed the idea of it. But certainly when he leaves home this time, he will never be coming back, and he will go on a pretty incredible journey. So I just want to thank you guys for the super chats, especially Gathering Place. Thanks very much for that. Yvonne Phillips as well. But all of you who made contributions. And then I want to thank members for being here. Thanks a lot for your comments. And I'll see you guys again Sunday for episode 24. From here on, things are going to definitely get exciting and are going to move in a bit of a different dimension. Right, Timmy? We're going to see what happens next. Hey, yeah. Okay, guys, take care. Thanks very much. See you guys next time.